There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a beach before dawn. Not the silence of peace, or rest, or quiet, but the silence of held breath. The silence of something enormous about to happen, and every living thing knowing it, and no one quite able to speak. On the 22nd of January 1944, more than 40,000 men crouched in darkness on landing craft off the coast of Italy, listening to that silence. The water was cold, the engines were cut to a murmur, and somewhere ahead, through the black, lay a strip of sand south of Rome that no one had ever heard of. A small Italian seaside town, unremarkable in peacetime, beloved by vacationers, forgotten by generals. Its name was Anzio. What happened on those beaches, and in the weeks and months that followed, is one of the most contested, most studied, and most human stories of the Second World War. Not because it was a great victory, not because it was a catastrophic defeat, but because it was both, wound together so tightly that historians are still arguing about where one ends and the other begins. This is the full story of the Battle of Anzio, from the desperate planning sessions in Cairo and London, to the ghostly quiet of the unopposed landing, to the brutal siege that followed, to the breakthrough that finally, after 4 months of blood and mud and grinding attrition, changed the shape of the Italian campaign. We will follow it from beginning to end, from the first ships gathering in darkness to the flags going up over Rome. So if you are settling in tonight, get comfortable. This one is long, and it earns every minute. Find your pillow, lower your light, and let the story come to you. Because here is the thing about Anzio that most people do not know when they first hear the name. The landing worked. The surprise worked. For a few extraordinary hours on that January morning, everything the planners had promised actually came true. Thousands of soldiers stepped off landing craft onto Italian sand and found almost nothing waiting for them. No machine guns, no massed artillery, no organized German defense, just a beach, a sleeping town, and an open road stretching north toward Rome. For one brief window, the path was clear. What happened next? Why that window closed? How the Germans recovered? Why the beachhead shrank into a siege? And why an operation designed to end the Italian stalemate instead became its most vivid symbol? That is the question at the heart of this documentary. And it is not a simple question with a simple answer. It involves a cautious general weighing impossible risks. It involves an enemy commander who lost the plot for hours and then recovered with terrifying speed. It involves ordinary soldiers, American and British and German, caught inside a perimeter that grew smaller and more dangerous by the day, with the sea at their backs and no way out. The men who fought at Anzio called it many things. Some of them called it a meat grinder. Some called it the world's largest self-sustaining prison camp. One soldier, writing home in the early weeks of the siege, described going to sleep under artillery fire, waking under artillery fire, eating under artillery fire, and slowly forgetting what it felt like to stand upright in open air without flinching. The beachhead was, at its worst, roughly 3 miles deep and 7 miles wide. Into that space, the Allies eventually packed more than 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, artillery, ammunition, field hospitals, fuel dumps, and all the grinding machinery of a modern army at war, and then watched as German guns on the surrounding hills rained down on it for weeks on end. There is a reason the soldiers gave a grim nickname to the German railgun that fired on them daily from somewhere to the north. They called it Anzio Anni. You name the thing that terrifies you. It makes it feel slightly more bearable. By the time the beachhead was finally broken open in late May, the Allies had suffered more than 70,000 casualties. Germany had lost more than 50,000 of its own. Rome would fall 4 days before the greatest amphibious operation in history, the landings in Normandy, and the Italian campaign, Anzio included, would be overshadowed almost immediately by the news from France. The men who bled in that narrow strip of Italian coastline found themselves footnotes in a war that had moved on without them. They deserve better than a footnote. What you are about to hear tonight is their story, told in full, from the beginning. We will start where every story like this must start, not at the beaches, not at the ships, but in the rooms where men with maps made decisions that other men with rifles would have to live and die inside of. We will go back to the autumn of 1943, to the Italian peninsula, in the grip of a stalemate that was breaking Allied confidence and Allied bodies in equal measure, to the mountain warfare around Cassino and the Winter Line, where the German army had turned geography into a weapon and was bleeding the Allies white, mile by mile, ridge by ridge, to the moment when someone in a planning room looked at a map, traced a finger up the coast and said, "What if we went around them instead of through them?" That question led to Anzio, and the answer turned out to be far more complicated than anyone in that planning room could have imagined. This documentary will take you through all of it: the ships gathering, the approach in darkness, the golden hours of opportunity on the morning of the landing, the slow, grinding drift from opportunity into siege, the counteroffensive that nearly shattered the beachhead entirely, the weeks of attrition and exhaustion, and finally, the breakthrough, the moment the doors of the trap swung open and the men who had survived finally moved forward. If you have been with this channel before, you know what to expect. The full sweep of the campaign, the human detail, the slow build of a story told properly. If you are new here, welcome. This is what we do. We sit with history long enough to understand it, not just catalogue it. Hit subscribe if you want more nights like this one. There are a great many more stories waiting. But for now, close your eyes if you want to. You can follow every word without watching the screen. Let the story carry you. The 22nd of January 1944. The waters off the Italian coast, cold and dark and full of ships. The silence before the landing. It is about to break. The autumn of 1943 had carried with it a particular kind of promise. After the hard-won campaign across the burning dust of North Africa, after the grinding push through Sicily, the Allied armies had set foot on the European continent itself, on the ancient soil of Italy, and for a brief, intoxicating moment, it had seemed as though momentum was everything. The toe of the Italian boot fell quickly, then the heel. Then, in a cascade of cautious optimism, Allied planners began to speak of Rome as a realistic destination, a city reachable before the year turned cold. Those conversations now felt like dispatches from another world entirely. By late 1943, the Allied advance had not stalled, it had been swallowed. The mountains of central Italy had consumed divisions whole, and the front lines had hardened into something that no longer resembled a campaign of movement. What remained looked, with brutal honesty, like a siege without walls. Men dug into frozen earth, staring across ridgelines that refused to fall. The geography of Italy had always been the enemy's ally, though it took the Allied armies some time to fully absorb that lesson. The Apennine mountain range runs like a spine down the length of the peninsula, creating a series of natural ridgelines and river valleys that any defender could exploit with even modest preparation. Where nature had not already done the work, the Germans had. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, was a man who understood terrain with the instinct of a geologist and the patience of a strategist who had no reason to hurry. He had read the land and built upon it, threading his defensive system through valleys and across ridges in a way that turned every Allied advance into a sequential ordeal. You could not outflank a mountain, you could only climb it, take it, and then discover another mountain waiting beyond. The defensive network the Germans had constructed across the Italian peninsula was not a single line, but a layered architecture of mutually supporting positions. Kesselring had organized his defenses in depth, so that when Allied forces finally overran one position after weeks of bitter effort, they found themselves facing another prepared line behind it, then another. The Gustav Line, anchored at its heart by Monte Cassino and the Rapido River Valley, was the most formidable of these barriers, a position that Allied commanders would come to regard with a mixture of professional respect and profound frustration. Monte Cassino itself, crowned by an ancient monastery, stared down on the approaches like a stone sentinel that no amount of artillery seemed willing to silence. Every assault against it became a lesson in the cost of frontal attacks against prepared mountain positions, lessons written in the most permanent ink available to war. The men fighting in those mountains experienced a kind of hardship that defied the language of military dispatches. Cold penetrated everything: boots, blankets, the metal of rifle bolts that stuck at the worst moments. Rain that autumn had transformed the mountain tracks into rivers of mud that swallowed vehicles and exhausted men in equal measure. Mule trains became the arteries of supply because no truck could navigate the terrain that soldiers were being asked to fight through. American, British, Commonwealth, French, and Polish troops all rotated through those ridgelines, each bringing their own particular tenacity, all discovering that tenacity alone could not substitute for the simple, unyielding fact that the Germans held the high ground and intended to keep it. Casualty figures from these weeks of mountain warfare were not the dramatic single-day totals of a great set-piece battle. They were the slow, steady arithmetic of attrition, accumulated through 100 small engagements that collectively added up to something devastating. The Allied command structure during this period was a complex hierarchy operating under strain. General Harold Alexander commanded 15th Army Group, overseeing both the American 5th Army under General Mark Clark and the British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery. Clark and Montgomery were not men who moved in easy harmony. Their approaches to warfare differed as much as their personalities, and the allocation of roads, resources, and priority between their two armies generated friction at a level below the headlines, but very much present in the daily conduct of operations. Above them, General Henry Maitland Wilson had assumed the supreme Allied commander role in the Mediterranean theater, inheriting a campaign that had achieved less than its architects intended. Winston Churchill, who had championed the Italian campaign with characteristic volcanic enthusiasm, was watching developments with growing impatience from London, his appetite for bold strokes unsatisfied by the grinding arithmetic of the Winter Line. The term Winter Line itself described not a single fortification but a general defensive reality, a zone in which German resistance had successfully frozen Allied movement as the season turned hostile. Running roughly across the width of the peninsula, it incorporated multiple defensive positions and natural obstacles in a system designed to hold for months. For the Allies to break through directly required either an overwhelming concentration of force that the Mediterranean theater could not produce, given that the highest priority in terms of men and materiel was already being directed toward the preparations for the cross-channel invasion planned for 1944, or it required some form of cleverness, some way of making the map work differently. The supply of men and equipment to Italy was itself a constant negotiation, every division earmarked for the Italian campaign a potential argument against resources needed elsewhere. Italy was, in the strategic calculus of the Allies, a secondary theatre, important but never the main event. What the Italian campaign was meant to accomplish had been the subject of debate since its inception. The original logic ran something as follows. Driving up Italy would tie down German divisions that might otherwise reinforce France or the Eastern Front, wear down German strength, and potentially open a route into the southern approaches of Germany's European empire. Whether Italy genuinely fulfilled this purpose, or whether it consumed Allied strength at a rate that made the whole enterprise of questionable net benefit, was an argument that officers conducted in private and historians would conduct for decades afterward. What was not arguable, by late 1943, was that the campaign had not produced the rapid movement its more optimistic advocates had projected. Rome, which some planners had imagined might fall before the end of the previous autumn, remained firmly in German hands, well over 100 kilometers north of where Allied soldiers stood shivering in their mountain positions. It was against this background of stalemate and strategic frustration that the idea of an amphibious end run began to recapture serious attention. The concept was not new. The notion of using Allied naval supremacy in the Mediterranean to land forces behind German lines had circulated in planning circles for some time. The sea offered something the mountains refused: freedom of movement. An amphibious force could, in principle, appear anywhere along the Italian coastline where suitable beaches existed, bypassing entirely the laborious process of forcing one defended ridgeline after another. If a landing could be placed far enough behind the winter line, it might threaten German supply routes so severely that Kesselring would have no choice but to pull forces back from their defensive positions to deal with the threat, creating the very movement the frontal assaults had failed to generate. The beaches near Anzio and Nettuno, a coastal town and small port roughly 50 kilometers south of Rome, emerged as the focal point for this thinking. The geography held a certain cold logic. A landing there would place Allied forces near the Alban Hills, a volcanic massif that dominated the approach roads leading south from Rome toward the German defensive lines. Control of the Alban Hills, or even the credible threat of controlling them, would strangle the German logistical system serving the winter line. German forces holding Monte Cassino and the broader Gustav Line defences received their supplies along routes that passed through precisely the area where an Anzio landing might operate. The map, when you looked at it with this particular argument in mind, made the operation seem almost irresistible. The sea lanes were Allied waters, the beaches were undefended, the Germans' flank was, at least in theory, exposed. Churchill's enthusiasm for the operation was characteristic and considerable. He is reported to have spoken with force about the need to break the Italian deadlock, about the waste of holding more than 100,000 men in static mountain positions while German forces sat unmolested. His appetite for operations that combined boldness with surprise had not diminished from earlier years, and the Anzio concept fit the template of the imaginative maneuver he consistently preferred over the grinding frontal assault. He pushed, argued, and drove the planning process with energy that younger men in the room sometimes struggled to match. Whether his enthusiasm sharpened the thinking behind the operation, or whether it pressured planners into overlooking serious problems in the concept, was a question that would haunt the operation's subsequent history. The planning process was also constrained by one resource that no amount of will could conjure from nothing: landing craft. The vessels required to put an army ashore from the sea were in desperately short supply across all Allied theatres by late 1943. Landing craft were being consumed by every competing operation: the Pacific, the upcoming cross-channel invasion, the ongoing requirements of the Mediterranean. To mount an amphibious operation at Anzio of sufficient scale to actually threaten German positions would require holding landing craft in the Mediterranean rather than releasing them for other uses, a decision that set the Anzio planners in direct competition with priorities that outranked them. The compromise that eventually emerged, enough craft for an initial landing force of modest size to be reinforced rapidly from the sea, was one of several factors that would shape the operation's character in ways its advocates found uncomfortable to acknowledge. By the close of 1943, the decision had essentially been made. The winter line had demonstrated that it would not be broken quickly by direct assault, and the cost of continuing to press frontally while waiting for conditions to improve was a price that commanders at every level recognized as unsustainable. The amphibious alternative, whatever its risks and complications, offered at least the possibility of movement, of transforming a siege into something with momentum again. The men at the winter line did not yet know that an entire fleet was beginning to assemble for their relief. They knew only the cold, the mud, and the ridgeline that still needed to be taken. The answer to their ordeal was being planned in offices far from the mountains, drawn on maps where the sea looked clean and the beaches at Anzio looked very close to Rome. The winter of 1943 had ground the Allied campaign in Italy into something approaching despair. Mountains that had seemed like obstacles on a map revealed themselves as fortresses when seen from the bottom, and every ridgeline held by German defenders cost blood to take, and sometimes more blood to hold. The winter line, that interlocking system of prepared positions, minefields, and mutually supporting gun emplacements, was not simply a defensive barrier. It was a killing machine, methodically fed by the terrain itself. Rivers ran cold and fast between the hills. Roads turned to mud under the weight of supply convoys, and then froze overnight into something that broke axles and exhausted men. The Allied armies were moving, but the word hardly seemed adequate. They were crawling, inch by painful inch, toward a Rome that seemed to retreat with every step forward they managed to take. It was in this atmosphere of stalled ambition that the idea of Anzio moved from a margin note to a serious proposal. The concept was not new. The possibility of an amphibious landing behind German lines on the western coast of Italy had been discussed in various forms for months. But discussion is not the same as commitment, and resources were the permanent obstacle. Landing craft were the scarcest commodity in the Allied arsenal at that point in the war. Every available vessel seemed to be promised to other operations, other theatres, other commanders with their own urgent claims. The landings in the south of France, the build-up for the cross-channel assault planned for the coming spring, the continuing demands of the Pacific, every one of these priorities competed for the same flat-bottomed boats that an Italian amphibious operation would need. For much of the autumn, Anzio existed as a good idea, waiting for a logistics solution that never quite arrived. What changed the equation was pressure from the very highest level of Allied command. Winston Churchill, who had championed the Italian campaign as a means of striking at what he described as the soft underbelly of the Axis, was watching the stalemate on the winter line with something between frustration and fury. The Prime Minister had invested enormous political capital in the Mediterranean strategy, and the grinding attritional warfare developing below Cassino was making that investment look poor. He pushed, argued, and negotiated for the landing craft that an Anzio operation would need, and he did so with the particular force of a man who believes he has been proven right about a grand strategy and is watching subordinates fail to execute it properly. Whether the underbelly was ever truly soft was a question for later. What mattered in December of 1943 was that Churchill wanted the landing, and Churchill's wants carried enormous weight. The planning that followed moved with urgency, born partly of genuine military logic and partly of political momentum that was difficult to stop once set in motion. Allied headquarters assembled the outlines of what would become Operation Shingle, and the concept was, at its core, elegantly simple. The main Allied armies below Cassino would launch an offensive against the Winter Line, fixing German forces in place and demanding their full attention. Simultaneously, an amphibious force would come ashore at Anzio and Nettuno, two small seaside towns roughly 60 kilometers south of Rome. Caught between an enemy attacking from the south and a fresh force suddenly appearing behind them, German commanders would face an impossible choice. Either they stripped the Winter Line to deal with the landing, in which case the main Allied armies would break through, or they held the Winter Line and allowed the Beachhead force to cut their supply routes and threaten Rome from the rear. The hammer and anvil logic was sound. On paper, the Germans could not win. What the paper could not fully capture was the gap between the plan's ambition and the resources allocated to execute it. The force assigned to Operation Shingle, to be landed on that exposed coast, behind enemy lines, with the sea at its back, numbered roughly 100,000 men across the full build-up, but initial assault waves would be considerably smaller than that. These troops would be carried by a fleet of landing craft scraped together through negotiation and delay, vessels that had been promised to other commands and were only temporarily diverted to Shingle. The commitment was not open-ended. The landing craft would land the force, supply it through the critical early days, and then many of them would be pulled away for other tasks. That constraint shaped everything about what the Beachhead force could realistically accomplish and how quickly it had to move to achieve anything decisive before German weight could be brought to bear. The terrain around Anzio had its own logic that planners examined carefully. The town itself sat on a small peninsula jutting into the Tyrrhenian Sea, surrounded by flat coastal plain called the Pontine Marshes to the south and east, and bisected by roads that led through small towns and farmland toward the Alban Hills. Those hills mattered enormously. They rose sharply from the coastal plain to the southeast of Rome, and from their heights, German observers could see almost everything happening on the roads below. If Allied forces could seize the Alban Hills following a successful landing, they would dominate the supply routes serving the German armies on the Winter Line and make Rome's defense extremely difficult. The hills were the strategic prize. Everything else was the means of getting there. But 60 kilometers of open ground separated the landing beaches from the Alban Hills, and that ground was not empty. Between Anzio and the hills lay networks of drainage canals, farmhouses built for defense, and roads that heavy armor would rapidly churn into impassable mud during the winter months. Moving quickly across that ground would require conditions, weather, German disorganization, aggressive leadership at every level, that could not be guaranteed. The planners knew this. What they were betting on was the psychological impact of the landing itself. A bold enough stroke, executed with enough surprise, might paralyze German decision-making long enough for Allied forces to seize the ground that mattered before the Germans recovered their balance. This was the assumption at the heart of Operation Shingle, and it was the assumption most vulnerable to being proved wrong. The question of surprise was treated as the operation's single greatest asset, and protecting it became an obsession among the planning staff. Preparations were made across multiple ports, with deliberate efforts to conceal their common purpose. Troops were briefed late, given false destinations when possible, and kept aboard ships as long as feasible to prevent information leaking through the ordinary social channels of soldiers in port cities. The Mediterranean was full of neutral vessels and enemy agents, and the Allied intelligence services were well aware that operational security in a theatre as geographically complex as the Mediterranean was never truly certain. What they had reason to hope was that the scale and direction of the landing could be kept hidden long enough. German intelligence, stretched across multiple potential threat axes and inclined towards certain assumptions about Allied intentions, might simply fail to connect the gathering fleet in Naples with a landing at Anzio specifically. There was, running beneath the confident planning documents, a current of unease that some officers expressed only in private correspondence and diary entries. The beachhead that would be established at Anzio would be, by its nature, exposed on three sides to a potentially hostile interior and dependent on the sea at its back. If the Germans recovered quickly, not panicked, not paralyzed, but simply reacted with professional competence, then the landing force might find itself holding a narrow strip of beach with inadequate room to maneuver and a very long wait before the main Allied armies could fight their way up from the south to link up. The mathematics of that scenario were not reassuring. Every day the beachhead remained isolated was another day for the Germans to bring more forces to bear, tighten the perimeter, and turn what was meant to be an aggressive outflanking maneuver into a siege. The plan counted on German failure. It had no confident answer for German competence. Command of the operation itself became a subject of quiet controversy before the first soldier stepped onto a landing craft. The senior commanders responsible for the Italian theatre had ideas about who should lead the assault, and those ideas were not always aligned with who was actually available and politically acceptable. The man who would ultimately receive the command brought with him a reputation for thoroughness and care that read differently depending on who was evaluating it. Some saw those qualities as exactly what a complex amphibious operation required: a commander who would not rush into catastrophe, who would ensure his force was properly established before pushing into danger. Others worried about a different reading of the same qualities. The beachhead, they argued, would not reward caution. It would reward speed, aggression, and willingness to accept risk in exchange for ground. Whether the commander assigned could provide that was a question nobody seemed quite prepared to answer definitively before the ships sailed. The orders that finally emerged from the planning process reflected a compromise between competing priorities that made them somewhat ambiguous in the critical early phase. The assault force was directed to seize and secure a beachhead, then to advance on the Colli Laziali, the Alban Hills, and threaten German lines of communication to the south. The word threaten carried considerable weight in those instructions, because it did not say seize, and it did not say destroy. It acknowledged that the force might not be able to do more than make the Germans uncomfortable, and that acknowledgement was embedded in the orders that would govern the first and most critical hours after the landing. Whether that ambiguity was prudent operational flexibility or a failure of nerve in the planning process itself remained one of the operation's most contested questions, debated long after the guns fell silent and the beaches were reclaimed by the sea. By the end of December, the decision was made and the machinery of war was turning. Supply depots received their requisitions. Unit commanders received their orders. The fleet began its preparations. Whatever doubts existed in the minds of the planners had been folded into documents, approved at levels too senior to question, and set aside in favor of the practical work of making the operation happen. Anzio was coming, and the weight of two armies, one already fighting its way up the spine of Italy, one about to emerge from the winter sea, was being placed on a plan that asked much, guaranteed little, and would very shortly meet the oldest test any military plan faces: contact with an enemy who had not read the script. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to generals, not the loneliness of the battlefield, where men fight and fall in the company of brothers, but something colder and quieter, the loneliness of knowing what is at stake and being the only man in the room who must carry that weight forward without flinching. In the winter of 1943, that weight fell on one man more than any other. His name was John P. Lucas, and the soldiers who served under him would come to know him as a careful, methodical commander who preferred certainty over gamble. What they could not fully know was how much he understood about the operation being handed to him, how clearly he saw its dangers, and how honestly he doubted whether the men ordering him forward had truly reckoned with what they were asking. Lucas had earned his place through decades of steady professional service. He was not a dashing cavalryman, not a headline-chasing general who courted press attention or performed confidence for the cameras. He was a soldier's soldier in the most traditional sense: organized, thorough, attentive to logistics, respectful of the enemy's capacity to surprise and destroy. By the time the planning for Operation Shingle was solidifying, Lucas had already seen enough of the Italian campaign to understand that the Germans in this theatre were not broken, not panicked, not a defeated army stumbling northward. They were a fighting force of considerable discipline, well led, dug into terrain that suited defense more than any ground Lucas had ever seen, and capable of rapid, violent response to almost any Allied initiative. When his superiors selected him to lead the Anzio landings, the appointment carried the quiet weight of a burden being placed on a man who already sensed its dimensions. General Harold Alexander, the senior Allied ground commander, had confidence in the operation's strategic design. General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army and Lucas's direct superior, was more complicated. A man capable of enormous ambition and occasional generosity, but not always consistent in the support he offered subordinates who were wrestling with his directives. Lucas was caught between a plan conceived at the highest levels and the practical realities that only a commander standing at the shoreline of that plan could fully see. He was not a man who expressed his doubts loudly, but he expressed them honestly in the pages of his private diary, writing with a candor that would later become famous for capturing the uncertainty that surrounded the entire enterprise. The risks Lucas saw were not imaginary. They were structural. The beachhead at Anzio would be shallow by necessity. The geography of the area offered no natural depth. The distance between the landing beaches and the Alban Hills, the dominating terrain feature that everyone agreed must be seized to make the operation meaningful, was short enough in kilometers, but potentially vast in terms of the fighting required to cross it. German armor stationed across central Italy could begin moving toward Anzio within hours of any landing, and once that armor arrived in strength, a lightly equipped force still sorting itself out on an exposed beach would have almost no answer for it. Lucas calculated the timelines in his head and arrived at conclusions that were not encouraging. The window between landing and German armored response was measured in hours, not days, and every hour the force spent establishing basic supply infrastructure rather than pushing inland was an hour the enemy was using to close that gap. Naval gunfire support was promised, and Lucas was not dismissive of its power. Naval guns could deliver enormous volumes of fire at considerable range, and the ships assigned to support the landings were capable vessels with experienced crews. But naval support was not unlimited, and it was not permanent. Ships had to rotate out for fuel, for ammunition resupply, for maintenance. The further inland Allied forces pushed, the less effective naval gunfire became, and once the beachhead expanded to the point where the fighting was happening beyond the gun's effective reach, that critical advantage would begin to erode. Lucas understood that the early days of any landing were the days of maximum naval support, and that making full use of those days required a controlled, disciplined build-up before any reckless sprint toward objectives that might outrun the protection the fleet could offer. His orders were not as ambiguous as later critics would sometimes suggest, but they were not perfectly clear either. The directive to establish a secure beachhead before breaking out inland was explicitly written into his operational guidance. What the orders did not specify with precision was how secure was secure, how much was enough before the breakout should begin, and at what point consolidation became excessive caution. That ambiguity was not accidental. It was the kind of language that gives senior commanders flexibility to claim credit if events go well, and to assign blame if events go badly. Lucas read those orders carefully and interpreted them in the light of everything he knew about the terrain, the enemy, and the forces available to him. His interpretation was conservative. Whether it was too conservative would become one of the most debated questions of the entire Italian campaign. What made his position even more difficult was the gap between what senior commanders said privately and what they communicated officially. Winston Churchill, who had championed the Anzio concept with enormous enthusiasm, wanted a bold stroke. He wanted the landing force to push aggressively inland, to cut German communications, to appear on the heights above the winter line like a force dropped from the sky. He had described his vision in language that suggested he expected the landing to create almost automatic disintegration of German resistance. Lucas, reading between those lines, understood that Churchill wanted results that the military situation on the ground might not deliver. The British Prime Minister was not a man who easily accepted the gap between strategic vision and operational reality, and Lucas knew that if the operation failed to produce quick results, the man most likely to bear the consequences was the commander on the beach, not the statesman in London. General Dwight Eisenhower, who had been watching Lucas's performance in earlier operations, had expressed quiet reservations about whether Lucas possessed the aggressive instinct the operation would demand. Those reservations did not prevent his appointment, but they circulated among senior officers in a way that created a quiet current of doubt around Lucas before the operation even began. When a commander's superiors have already begun to question his temperament in private conversation, the relationship between that commander and his chain of command is subtly altered. Every decision Lucas made would be viewed through the lens of those prior doubts, and the margin for error, already thin, became thinner still. He operated in an environment where caution would be labeled as failure and boldness, if it went wrong, would produce catastrophe. He was 54 years old in January of 1944, a man with silver hair and tired eyes that had seen a great deal of war across two conflicts spanning decades. His diary entries during the planning phase reveal a man who had looked at the Anzio operation honestly and concluded that it was asking more than it was offering. He wrote that he felt like a lamb being led to slaughter, a phrase that has followed his historical reputation ever since. That phrase is often cited as evidence of defeatism, of a commander who had already surrendered the psychological initiative before the first soldier stepped off a landing craft. But it can be read another way, as the honest assessment of an experienced officer who understood that the enterprise he was being sent to lead was built on assumptions that might not survive contact with reality. Among the staff officers who worked with him daily, Lucas's manner was deliberate rather than inspirational. He did not project the commanding charisma of a Patton or the cool certainty of some of his contemporaries. He asked careful questions, studied maps for long periods in silence, and checked his logistical figures repeatedly before committing to decisions. Some found this reassuring, a commander who did not waste lives on unconsidered impulses. Others found it frustrating, a disposition that seemed better suited to garrison administration than the urgent tempo of an amphibious assault. Both readings contained truth. Lucas was a man whose virtues and whose limitations were the same quality expressed in different circumstances. On the eve of the operation, as the fleet was completing its preparations and the soldiers were making their final checks, Lucas understood that the moment was approaching when all of his analysis would be tested by events beyond his control. He had prepared as thoroughly as the time allowed. He had studied the terrain, reviewed the intelligence, argued for greater resources, and received partial answers. He had his orders, his reservations, and his sense of professional duty, and these three things did not always point in the same direction. The landings would come before dawn, and whatever happened on those beaches would begin the process of either vindicating or condemning everything he had concluded about the operation's possibilities and its risks. History was moving, and he was positioned at its edge, carrying the weight that belongs to every commander who knows both the cost of failure and the price of caution, and who must choose between them, alone, in the dark, before the guns begin. Naples in January 1944 was a city still wearing its wounds. Bomb craters pocked the harbour front. Warehouses stood gutted, their iron frames twisted against winter skies. The port had been wrecked methodically by the retreating Germans only months before. Every crane toppled, every dock mined, every navigational marker removed, and yet, through the combined effort of Allied engineers working around the clock through autumn and early winter, it had been stitched back together into something functional, something capable once more of receiving and dispatching the enormous weight of modern war. By the first week of January, the transformation was accelerating. Ships began arriving, not in ones and twos, but in convoys, nudging into berths along reconstructed quays, offloading and loading simultaneously, in a rhythm that looked, from the hills above, like a city breathing faster and faster as some invisible exertion approached. The vessels themselves came from everywhere. American attack transports steamed in from North African ports. British landing ships, heavy and low in the water, moved through the Straits of Messina and turned north. Smaller craft, the flat-bottomed landing ships for tanks and infantry that had proven their worth at Sicily and Salerno, were towed and ferried in clusters, tied together like rafts, ungainly and awkward but essential. Across the Mediterranean, in harbours stretching from Bizerti to Oran, the same quiet accumulation was underway. Supply officers worked in lamplight through the night hours, matching manifests to holds, calculating how many tons of artillery ammunition could share space with field rations, how many vehicles could be stacked on tank landing ships without making them dangerously top-heavy. It was unglamorous, technical, exhausting work, and on it rested everything. Assembling a fleet of this size without attracting attention required a particular kind of discipline. Individual movements were unremarkable. A single transport arriving at Naples drew no special scrutiny, and the port had been busy with resupply traffic throughout the autumn campaign. But the accumulation, the sheer accumulation, was the danger. Each ship that arrived added to a picture that, if observed and reported, could unravel the entire enterprise. Security officers worked to restrict the flow of information, controlling dock access, monitoring communications, and keeping soldiers ignorant of their destination until the last possible moment. Loose talk in a Naples bar, a carelessly written letter home, a clerk who mentioned too much to the wrong person. Any of these could carry a thread that, if pulled, might unravel the operation entirely. The secrecy was enforced with a rigidity that was not always comfortable and not always popular, but it held. The men being loaded onto those ships came from the full breadth of the Allied coalition. American infantry divisions that had fought through the mud of southern Italy came off the line, were given cursory rest, and were told to prepare for embarkation. British and Commonwealth troops, already veterans of the North African campaign and the landings at Sicily, filed into embarkation areas carrying everything they owned on their backs or crammed into kit bags. There were engineers who would need to build roads and bridges the moment the beachhead was established. There were signal corps men carrying radio equipment whose weight seemed designed specifically to punish the human spine. There were artillery crews and their ammunition handlers, medical units with their impossible loads of supplies, military policemen, cooks, drivers, all the human infrastructure that an army in the field requires to function, compressed now into the steel holds of ships riding at anchor in a winter harbour. For most of the soldiers, the destination was unknown to them well into the preparatory period. They had been given cover stories, or simply no story at all, movement orders that told them where to report, but not where they were going. Some had heard rumours, because armies run on rumours as much as they run on supply lines, and the rumours ran the full range of possibility. There was talk of landings further up the Italian coast. There was speculation about the south of France. A few men, those who had studied maps in better times, made educated guesses about the geography of the Italian coast north of the German winter line, and arrived, privately, at roughly the right answer. But for most, the uncertainty was simply one more condition of military life to be endured alongside cold rations, damp clothing, and the low-grade anxiety that had become the permanent weather of their existence since the shooting started. The loading process was organized down to the minute, on paper, and was, in practice, only slightly more chaotic than paper suggested. Vehicles were the worst of it. Trucks, half-tracks, jeeps, ammunition carriers, bulldozers. Everything had to be driven or winched onto landing ships in the right sequence, because the sequence of loading determined the sequence of unloading, and the sequence of unloading determined whether units could function in the first hours after the assault. Get it wrong and a unit's heavy weapons might sit in a hold behind the vehicles of a completely different formation, unreachable until half a day had passed. Quartermasters and transport officers moved through embarkation areas with clipboards and expressions of barely contained frustration, arguing with drivers, redirecting columns, and making the continuous stream of on-the-spot adjustments that the gap between planning and reality always demands. The naval component of the operation was itself a small world of complexity. Warships would provide the gunfire support that had proved so decisive at Sicily and so critical at Salerno, cruisers and destroyers positioned to deliver fire onto any German armoured formation that moved against the beachhead in the vulnerable first hours. Minesweepers would lead the fleet in, their crews working in darkness, clearing lanes through waters that might or might not carry German naval mines. Escort vessels would guard the flanks of the convoys during the approach, watching for German submarine activity and for the fast torpedo boats, the E-boats, that operated along the Italian coast. Landing craft control vessels would direct the assault waves onto the correct beaches in the darkness before dawn. Each of these tasks required coordination with every other, and the naval planning staff had been working through contingencies and counter-contingencies for weeks, producing plans thick enough to use as weapons in their own right. There was a physical misery to the waiting that became its own kind of wait. January in the Mediterranean is not the torpid blue of summer travel posters. The sea runs grey and unpredictable, swell lines rolling in from the northwest, the wind off the water carrying a cold that cuts through field jackets and wool liners without much ceremony. Men standing watch on the decks of transport ships in Naples harbour pulled their collars up and counted the days. In the holds below, where troops were stacked in tiered bunks with barely enough room to sit upright, the air thickened with the smells of cigarette smoke, canvas, machine oil, and the particular human closeness that makes extended confinement aboard a ship an exercise in tolerance. Seasickness had not yet fully announced itself. That would come when the fleet moved, but the low-grade nausea of an enclosed space on water was already making its presence known. The supplies themselves were staggering in their variety and quantity. Artillery shells by the tens of thousands, crated and stenciled, canned rations for men who would have no access to field kitchens in the first days, signal wire on enormous reels, cases of medical supplies, bandages, morphine, surgical instruments, that the medical officers hoped desperately they would not need in anything like the quantities being loaded. Fuel in cans and drums, enough to move a motorized army across a beachhead and beyond, if the beachhead could be broken. Barbed wire, sandbags, engineer materials, water. The logisticians who calculated these loads were working not just from anticipated need, but from the lessons of earlier operations, where resupply across an open beach under enemy fire had proved far harder than anyone's mathematics had suggested. Better to load too much and not need it than to need it and find the hold empty. The secrecy, against all reasonable expectation, continued to hold. German intelligence, stretched thin across multiple theatres and heavily reliant on aerial reconnaissance that Allied air forces were working to suppress, did not detect the assembly in time to act on it. There were moments of vulnerability, a merchant sailor who saw too much, an intercepted communication that might have carried suggestive detail, but the operational security protocols absorbed these risks. The German command in Italy, led by Field Marshal Kesselring, was aware, in a general sense, that some form of amphibious threat existed along the Italian coast. It was unavoidable that the Allies possessed this capability and might use it. But the specific timing, the specific location, the specific scale, these remained hidden. Kesselring kept his reserves positioned to respond to multiple threats, which meant they were concentrated at none of them. As the 20th of January passed into the 21st, the fleet began its final preparations. Soldiers received their last briefings, sand table models of the beaches studied for the 100th time, the sequence of events rehearsed until it was memorized rather than merely understood. Chaplains moved through the ships, finding whatever space was available in crowded holds and passageways to hold services for men of varying faith and varying observance. Officers checked their watches and then checked them again. Engines were tested, fuel tanks topped off. On the destroyers, ammunition was moved to ready positions. In the landing craft control vessels, navigation officers bent over charts, tracing the approach routes one more time, checking and rechecking the coordinates that would bring thousands of men to the right stretch of Italian sand rather than the wrong one. Somewhere in that harbour, in the dark between ships riding at anchor, the operation existed still in that fragile, perfect state before any plan meets reality, intact, possible, full of hope, and heading toward a dawn that no one aboard could yet read. The sun had barely touched the horizon on the evening of the 21st of January 1944. when the last of the order signals passed through the fleet, and a silence descended that would not break until the beaches of Anzio were already in sight. Across the harbour approaches of Naples and the scattered anchorages that had served as staging points throughout the Mediterranean, engines turned over in the hulls of transport ships, landing craft and warships, until the water itself seemed to vibrate with low, sustained purpose. Sailors who had spent days loading ammunition crates, ration boxes, and crated equipment now stood at their posts and watched the shoreline of southern Italy recede behind them. There was something final in the way the land disappeared. Not a dramatic vanishing, but a slow, indifferent withdrawal, as though the coast itself had chosen to look away from what was coming. Officers moved through their ships quietly, checking manifests, verifying positions in the convoy formation, doing the small procedural work that keeps large organizations from dissolving into confusion. Soldiers below decks heard the change in engine tempo and understood, without being told, that the waiting was over. The fleet was moving north. More than 300 vessels of various shapes and purpose composed the armada that pushed out into the Tyrrhenian Sea that evening. The formation stretched across miles of dark water, organized into columns and groups according to function, the big transports carrying the bulk of the infantry, the smaller landing ships carrying tanks and artillery, and the heavy vehicles that an army consumes as surely as it consumes food, the destroyers and cruisers running alongside as escort and fire support, and far ahead, the minesweepers that had been working through the daylight hours and into the dusk to clear the sea lanes of anything that could tear the hull from a transport and send 600 men into the cold, dark water without warning. The minesweepers had begun their work well before the fleet departed, and the passage north had been planned with enough precision that each ship had a designated lane to follow, a corridor of safe water that had been verified, logged, and verified again. The route was not straight. No direct approach was considered safe, but it had been calculated to avoid the concentrations of enemy-laid mines that Allied intelligence believed lay scattered across the more obvious approaches. Everything that could be known had been mapped. Everything that could not be known was carried in the tightened jaw of every sailor on watch. Radio silence fell across the fleet like a physical weight. For days the ships had communicated in the ordinary rhythm of naval coordination, position reports, logistical updates, weather assessments passing back and forth between vessels and shore stations. Now all of that stopped. The antennae were live but passive, receiving only, generating nothing. Any transmission strong enough to be intercepted could give the fleet's position and heading to German direction-finding stations monitoring the Mediterranean frequencies, and that possibility was considered unacceptable. The cost of radio silence was that if something went wrong, a collision, a mechanical failure, a contact with an uncharted minefield, the response would be slower, the communication between ship and shore reduced to the physical speed of a signal lamp, or the risk of breaking silence altogether. The commanders had weighed that cost and accepted it. Surprise was worth more than convenience. Surprise, in the arithmetic of amphibious operations, was worth lives that would otherwise be spent fighting through a prepared defense. And so the fleet moved north in silence, each ship a separate island of contained noise, in an ocean that offered no reflection of its passage. Below the waterline of the transport ships, in the holds and troop compartments that had been designed for cargo and converted for human beings with varying degrees of success, thousands of soldiers occupied the hours in the ways that soldiers have always occupied the last hours before an assault. Some cleaned their weapons with a methodical attention that had less to do with mechanical necessity than with the need to be doing something purposeful with their hands. Rifles were broken down and reassembled. Bayonets were wiped and re-wiped. Kit was checked and reorganized, and checked again in a ritual that bordered on the obsessive, but served its purpose. It kept the mind anchored to the concrete and away from the abstract terror of what was coming. Others played cards in tight clusters, the games continuing for hours, with a concentration that seemed disproportionate to the stakes of the game itself. The stakes of the game being the only stakes any of them had the power to control in that moment. A few managed genuine sleep, curled against equipment bags with the uncanny ability of the experienced soldier to rest in any condition. The young ones, and there were many young ones, men barely past their 20th year who had been soldiers for less time than the Italian campaign had already consumed, tended to be the most awake, the most still. They sat with their thoughts in ways that their older companions had learned to avoid. Veterans of Sicily and Salerno had accumulated a particular knowledge that the newest men had not yet earned, that the imagination, left unsupervised in the small hours before a landing, will construct catastrophes with far more detail and vividness than reality typically delivers. The older men had their own fears, but they had learned to fence them in, to reduce them to manageable dimensions by occupying the mind with something else. The young men had not yet learned that trick, and so they sat with the motion of the ship, and the smell of diesel, and seasickness, and the distant vibration of the engines, and thought about the beaches they had never seen. Seasickness itself was a quiet cruelty that ran through the fleet regardless of rank or experience. The Tyrrhenian Sea in January is not a gentle body of water, and the landing craft in particular, shallow-drafted, flat-bottomed vessels that rode the surface rather than cutting through it, responded to every swell with a corkscrew motion that defeated most attempts at equilibrium. Men who had crossed the Atlantic, who had weathered previous landings, found themselves leaning over the rail in the darkness, reduced to the most fundamental kind of misery. There is a grim democracy to severe seasickness. It does not distinguish between the general and the private, between the decorated veteran and the man on his first operation. Medics moved through the compartments offering what they could, which was limited, and the smell below decks in many of the smaller craft became something that the men who survived Anzio would remember long after the specifics of the fighting had softened. It was not the most dignified way to approach a battle, being sick on the way there, but armies approach battles in every possible state of human condition, and dignity is rarely among the requirements. The officers commanding the naval gunfire ships, the cruisers and destroyers that would provide fire support once the landings began, had their own quiet work underway as the fleet pushed north. Targeting data was being reviewed, fire missions pre-planned, crew positions tested and restated. The naval gunfire support available to the landing force was one of the genuine strengths of the operation, a fact that had been emphasized in the planning sessions and would prove its worth many times before the campaign was finished. These ships carried the ability to deliver concentrated, accurate fire to ranges and in quantities that no field artillery park could match, and the knowledge that this support existed was a form of comfort to the infantry commanders, even if no amount of naval gunfire could eliminate the fundamental exposure of a man crossing open beach in the pre-dawn dark. Comfort, in military planning, is often measured in margins rather than absolutes. Somewhere in the middle distance behind the fleet, the Italian coastline continued its ordinary nighttime business. Fishing villages dark, German garrison positions lit by their own fires and lanterns, the main body of German forces deployed along the winter line far to the south, their attention directed toward the Allied armies pressing against them from that direction. German naval and air reconnaissance had maintained a general awareness of Allied shipping concentrations around Naples, but the interpretation of that activity had not crystallized into anything approaching certainty about an imminent landing. The logic that had made Anzio seem an unlikely target earlier now worked in the Allies' favor. German planners who had concluded that Anzio posed little strategic attraction as a landing site had not fundamentally revised that conclusion, even as the evidence multiplied. Intelligence is always an argument between what the evidence shows and what the analyst expects, and on this particular night, German expectation was winning the argument. The minesweepers running ahead of the main body moved through their work in a state of suppressed anxiety. The cleared lanes behind them were the condition of possibility for everything that followed, and any lapse, any mine that passed through the sweep undetected, any cable that failed to function as designed, could close the corridor in an instant and announce the fleet's approach through the only means available to it, an explosion. The sweepers maintained their own radio silence, communicating with the main fleet through pre-arranged signal procedures, and the weight of responsibility carried by the small crews aboard them was entirely disproportionate to the size of the vessels. They were not glamorous ships, they were functional ones, and on the night of the 21st of January, they were arguably the most important ships in the fleet. As the hours deepened toward midnight and then past it, the fleet's navigation plots began to show the coastline of the Italian peninsula curving in from the north. Position checks were made by the navigating officers using every means available. Star sights taken in brief breaks in the cloud cover, depth soundings run in silence, coastal topography matched against charts that had been studied until the paper wore soft at the folds. The beaches at Anzio were not the beaches at Normandy, not yet part of any legend, but the men navigating toward them in the darkness understood them by their physical characteristics: gradient, composition, width at low tide, the positions of any obstructions. The landing had been planned around the specific geography of those beaches, and the geography would now determine whether the plan survived contact with reality. The German army, sleeping in its positions across the Italian peninsula, remained completely unaware. Patrol boats had not encountered the fleet. Air reconnaissance, grounded by weather and by the scheduling of missions that had not targeted the Tyrrhenian approach lanes that night, had found nothing. The intelligence assessments that reached German headquarters before dawn on the 22nd of January reported no unusual activity, no signs of imminent amphibious operation, nothing that required immediate escalation. The sea had kept its secret. More than 100,000 men, thousands of tons of supplies, hundreds of vehicles, and the entire weight of Allied strategic ambition in Italy were approaching the shore of a country that did not know they were coming, carried on dark water through a darkness that would not last much longer. At 2 o'clock in the morning, on the 22nd of January 1944, the war along the Italian coast held its breath. The first landing craft ground against the sand on beaches north and south of the town of Anzio, and soldiers who had spent the crossing fighting seasickness and dread suddenly found themselves stepping into shallow, cold water with rifles raised and hearts hammering against their ribs. They expected fire. They expected the terrible orchestra of machine guns and mortar rounds that had greeted Allied landings elsewhere, the chaos and blood of men cut down before they could even find their footing. What they found instead was silence, a silence so complete and so unexpected that many soldiers paused at the waterline, confused, waiting for the world to explode around them. It never did. The beaches were empty. The Germans were not there. The American forces landed on the beaches designated to the south, near the town itself, while British troops came ashore on the beaches stretching northward along the coast. Both forces moved with the careful, hunched urgency of men who could not yet believe their good fortune. Sergeants hissed at their men to keep moving, keep spacing, stop bunching together. Habits drilled into bone through months of training, now misfiring against an absence of enemy fire rather than its presence. Engineers were among the first ashore, sprinting up the beach to check for mines, marking lanes with tape, clearing the way for the thousands who would follow. The beach parties worked fast and quietly, and the machinery of the landing began to function with a precision that even its planners had not dared to fully expect. The first critical minutes, which had destroyed so many amphibious operations in other theatres of the war, passed without catastrophe. Within the first hour, signals began filtering back through the chain of command that carried a quality that staff officers at headquarters barely knew how to process. Resistance light, casualties minimal, advance proceeding. These were not the words anyone had prepared themselves for. The planning for Operation Shingle had accounted for significant losses in the first wave. It was simply the arithmetic of forcing men against a defended coastline. That the arithmetic was being rewritten in real time, with men walking inland instead of dying on the waterline, generated a cautious but unmistakable electricity through the command structure. General Lucas, aboard his command ship offshore, received these early reports with the tempered relief of a man who had spent weeks anticipating disaster. The disaster had not come, not yet. The German forces garrisoning the Anzio area were thin in number and caught completely flat-footed. A small number of construction troops and coastal defense personnel had been present near the beaches, but nothing resembling an organized combat force capable of repelling a full amphibious assault. Some Germans were captured still in their billets, pulled from sleep into captivity without having fired a single shot. Others melted away into the darkness, falling back toward the nearest larger formations to report what they had seen. For the soldiers coming ashore in their hundreds, and then their thousands, it was surreal, a world of low, flat terrain, scattered umbrella pines, and the distant glimmer of the town's buildings, all of it entirely uncontested. The war, which had been a relentless grinder of attrition and mountain mud for months, had been temporarily suspended by the sheer audacity of what the Allies had just done. By the time the January sky began to lighten toward grey at its eastern edge, the scale of the Allied presence on that coast had grown dramatically. Thousands of men were ashore and moving. Vehicles were being unloaded from landing ships that had pushed their flat bows directly onto the beach, ramps slamming down into the sand as jeeps, artillery pieces, and ammunition carriers rolled forward. The beaches north and south of Anzio were alive with movement, and the controlled noise of a massive military machine assembling itself from the sea. Medical teams established their first aid posts. Signal units ran wire. Commanders moved inland to find their units, check their lines, and push their forward elements as far as caution and their orders would take them. In the pre-dawn grey, it looked less like an invasion and more like an occupation, swift, methodical, and almost bloodless. The town of Anzio itself was entered early in the morning, and the small fishing port that gave the operation its name was taken without a fight. The harbour facilities, relatively undamaged, represented a significant logistical prize, a port through which supplies could be pushed more efficiently than over open beaches, where surf and weather were always uncertain partners. British troops securing their sector to the north found similarly sparse resistance and pushed several miles inland before the morning was fully underway. Patrols pushed toward the Mussolini Canal to the south and toward the road networks that knitted the region together, and everywhere they found the same improbable truth. The Germans were not there in any force capable of stopping them. A coastal road, a network of farm tracks across reclaimed marshland, and the flat fields of the Pontine Plain lay open before them. The reports reaching Allied command in those early morning hours were striking in their consistency. Across both landing sectors, commanders described a military situation that bordered on the implausible given the stakes of the operation. Beachhead secured, enemy contact minimal, inland movement possible. Staff officers who had spent weeks gaming out worst-case scenarios, counterattacks in the surf, mined beaches, concentrated artillery dropping on the landing zones, found themselves recalibrating against a reality that was almost the best case the planners had dared to sketch. Back at Allied headquarters further south, General Harold Alexander received word that the landing had succeeded beyond reasonable expectation. The question now forming, the question that would come to define everything that followed, was what to do with that success in the hours before the Germans recovered their footing. Among the ordinary soldiers moving through those early morning fields, there was a quality to the experience that veterans would recall for the rest of their lives. The absence of fire, the strange quiet of an Italian winter morning, cold and flat-lit, the soil damp beneath their boots, everything smelling of salt air and turned earth. Men who had fought their way up the spine of Italy through mud and fire and attrition found themselves walking forward without flinching, without scanning for the muzzle flash that meant someone was about to die. A British infantryman pushing inland with his section would have passed through fields of winter stubble, past farmhouses with their shutters drawn, under the dark shapes of pine trees standing against a sky beginning to bleed the first pale colour of dawn. It was not peace, they knew better than that, but it was the closest thing to it that many of them had felt in months. By mid-morning, the beachhead had taken on a more solid and organised shape. Command posts were established. Artillery batteries were being registered on their survey data, ready to fire. Anti-aircraft guns were dug in and pointed skyward in anticipation of the Luftwaffe response that would inevitably come as daylight made the Allied presence visible from the air. Naval gunfire support ships maintained their offshore positions, their guns ready to reach out across the flat coastal plain at any German formation that presented itself. The logistical flow from ship to shore was running faster than projected, which was itself a kind of miracle, given the variables that could disrupt such an operation. Thousands of men were now on Italian soil behind the German lines, and the bridgehead they had been ordered to establish was, in its first hours, a genuine reality rather than a hope sketched on a planning map. The German reaction was building somewhere beyond the horizon. In the telephone calls and urgent radio traffic moving between headquarters that morning, as commanders tried to understand what had happened and what it meant. But in those first hours, the Allies did not yet feel that reaction. They felt only the momentum of what they had achieved, the extraordinary fact of their presence. More than 35,000 men were ashore by midday, with vehicles, guns, and supplies still flowing from the fleet onto the beaches. The numbers would continue to climb through the afternoon and into the following days as the build-up accelerated. The Germans had not pushed them back into the sea. The mines had not shredded the landing craft. The air attacks had not broken the fleet. Everything the planners had feared, and everything the soldiers had dreaded, had, in these first hours, failed to materialize. There is something almost vertiginous about reading the early accounts of that morning. The gap between what was expected and what occurred creates its own particular kind of drama. Commanders wrote of the landing with a controlled astonishment, careful not to declare victory before they had consolidated, but unable to entirely suppress the recognition that something extraordinary had happened. The men who had waded ashore in darkness and silence had seized a piece of the Italian coast without paying the terrible price that had seemed inevitable. For a few hours, The operation that had been born in desperation and controversy stood vindicated by the simple, undeniable fact of its success. The beaches were held, the port was taken, thousands were ashore and moving. What those early reports could not capture, and what the soldiers moving inland in the thin winter light could not yet know, was that the silence around them was already ending. Somewhere north and east, beyond the flat fields and the pine-lined roads, German commanders were already reaching for their telephones. Units were already being ordered to move. The machinery of response was already turning. The miracle of the unopposed landing had brought the Allies something extraordinary and fragile, a window of time and possibility that the operation had been designed to exploit at full speed. Whether that window would be seized or allowed to quietly close was the question that the coming hours would begin, slowly and then with terrible clarity, to answer. The morning of the 22nd of January broke over the Anzio beaches with a clarity that seemed almost incongruous with the magnitude of what was unfolding. Soldiers emerged from landing craft into a world of comparative peace. No curtain of machine gun fire, no shell-torn sand, no organized German resistance waiting to repel them. The surprise had worked. The Germans, stretched thin across the Italian peninsula and caught off guard by this audacious assault, had failed to anticipate the blow falling upon them at precisely this moment and at precisely this location. What had been rehearsed 100 times in briefings, and what had seemed almost impossible in the days before, now materialized as reality. An entire beachhead, established with minimal cost, a foothold in what might become the strategic hammer blow that broke the German hold on Italy. By mid-morning, tens of thousands of American and British troops had moved inland from the beaches, establishing a perimeter and digging in. Supply ships began unloading vast quantities of ammunition, rations, vehicles, and medical supplies. The initial reports flowing back to higher command spoke almost of miracle, one of those rare moments in war when audacity and surprise created an asymmetry so complete that the enemy seemed paralyzed. But within those golden hours of opportunity, with German forces still disorganized and their response merely beginning to form, a decision was being made that would ripple through the entire campaign and transform what had begun as daring maneuver into something far more grinding and uncertain. General John P. Lucas stood at his command post in the beachhead's interior, receiving reports of unopposed progress, hearing of American units pushing inland without significant resistance, learning that the initial assault had cost far fewer casualties than the most optimistic pre-landing estimates. He held in his hands a moment of extraordinary opportunity, a window of time that would not remain open long, a brief interval before German reserves could be marshaled and concentrated. His standing orders were explicit in their priority: establish and secure the beachhead, build up forces and supplies, create a firm base from which operations could be conducted. But those orders carried within them a tension, an unresolved contradiction between security and speed, between caution and exploitation. Some commanders, had they stood in Lucas's position, might have interpreted those orders differently. They might have seen in the minimal German resistance and the chaos evident in enemy communications not an invitation to prudence, but rather a clarion call to audacity. They might have reasoned that the moment of German disorganization was ephemeral, that every hour spent consolidating was an hour the Germans used to prepare their response, that the true security of the beachhead lay not in defensive depth, but in rapid exploitation of German weakness. Lucas, however, was not such a commander. He was methodical, experienced, and acutely conscious of the vulnerability inherent in an amphibious operation, the narrowness of the beachhead, the limited supplies, the vulnerability to counterattack from forces already positioned in Italy. The caution that might have seemed timid in another context appeared in this moment almost prudent, a recognition of genuine peril. The afternoon of the landing was consumed by the systematic work of building rather than exploiting. Supply dumps were established in precise grid patterns across the inland area of the beachhead, organized caches of ammunition, fuel, rations, and spare parts arranged with meticulous care. Artillery pieces that had come ashore in the morning were being positioned in carefully surveyed locations, their fields of fire calculated and overlapped, creating the sinews of a defensive network. Engineers were already laying telephone lines, establishing signal stations, creating the infrastructure of command and control. Medical personnel were setting up field hospitals in what had been farmland hours before, preparing for the casualties that were still to come. Anti-tank guns were positioned at likely approach routes, their crews receiving briefings on the German armor they might encounter. From a purely tactical perspective, the work being done was sound, professional, and thorough. A beachhead that could receive supplies in the face of German attack, that could respond with coordinated artillery fire, that could move reserves rapidly to threatened points, was a beachhead that could hold. This was not incompetence or cowardice or excessive caution divorced from reality. This was the application of legitimate military principles to a situation of genuine vulnerability. The landing craft that had brought these men ashore could only carry supplies and reinforcements during daylight hours and good weather. German air attacks could be expected. German artillery was already within range. The beachhead was in fact tiny, and the forces that could be supplied through such a narrow portal were limited by physics and logistics as surely as by enemy action. Yet what Lucas could not fully account for was the opposite side of that equation, the cost of time to the enemy. At that very moment, with Germans first hearing reports of the landing, German commanders were beginning to move reserves toward the beachhead, but their concentration would take days to complete. German forces were scattered across the peninsula, committed to the winter-line fighting, dispersed across a broad front. Each hour that passed without major German counterattacks allowed German staff officers to coordinate movements, allowed reserves to arrive, allowed what was initially a dangerous but potentially exploitable crisis to become a managed tactical situation. The division between rapidity and security was not as clear as it might have appeared from the safety of a command post. Pushing inland aggressively, cutting toward the Alban Hills or toward the German supply lines that sustained the winter line, would have carried risks, the risk of overextension, the risk of being cut off and destroyed piecemeal by German counterattacks, the risk of losing the beachhead entirely. But it would also have transformed the situation from a German perspective, would have forced German commanders to respond not according to their developing plans, but according to the dictates of Allied aggression. By consolidating, by creating security, by building up strength, Lucas was choosing a strategy that maximized the likelihood of holding the beachhead, but minimized the possibility of using that beachhead to achieve the strategic breakthrough it was designed to create. As evening fell on the 22nd of January, the beachhead had taken on the character of an encampment rather than a bridgehead. Defensive lines were being hardened around the perimeter, a rough circle roughly 7 miles in width and perhaps 3 miles in depth, a narrow strip of Italian territory held by increasingly dense concentration of Allied troops and equipment. The supplies that were flowing ashore by the tens of thousands of tons were being stored, organized, and protected. Rations were being distributed, ammunition counted and positioned, fuel managed with careful attention to consumption rates and resupply. Wounded from the morning's landing operations were already being transported back to the beaches for evacuation by hospital ships. The machinery of supply and logistics, the vast and intricate network of people and systems that allowed an army to function, was being assembled in real time. This was not the work of incompetent men or cowardly men. The officers directing this work understood military realities. They understood that armies without supplies could not fight, that forces without ammunition could not hold ground, that wounded soldiers left without medical care became liabilities rather than assets. The competence visible in these efforts was genuine and substantial, and yet the hours were passing. German telephone lines were carrying orders to scattered units. German staff officers were calculating the distance from their current positions to Anzio and the time required to cover it. German commanders were beginning to understand, with growing clarity, that this landing was no feint, no minor diversion, but rather a major assault that threatened their entire position in Italy. By the 23rd of January, the character of the German response had begun to crystallize. What had been fragmentary and uncertain on the previous day was becoming coordinated and purposeful. German reconnaissance elements were probing the beachhead's perimeter, testing its strength and looking for weakness. German artillery was beginning to register on Allied positions, and the first shells began falling into the beachhead with increasing frequency. German pilots, operating from airfields closer to Anzio than the German High Command had anticipated, were beginning to appear overhead, though their attacks were not yet coordinated or overwhelming. Most significantly, German reserves were beginning to arrive. Mechanized units moving down roads toward the beachhead, infantry divisions being pulled from the winter line, armor being concentrated at assembly areas. The moment of complete German disorganization was passing. The window that had existed on the morning of the landing, the interval during which German forces were scattered and unprepared, was visibly closing. What had seemed in the dawn hours of the 22nd to be a temporary advantage that might be exploited was transforming into a permanent constraint on Allied options. The beachhead would hold, almost surely. The defences being built, the supplies being accumulated, the troops being organised. These were substantial enough that a German attack, conducted under the constraints of German logistics and manpower, would be unlikely to push the Allies back into the sea. But whether the beachhead would become what it was designed to be, a hammer blow that broke German lines and forced a retreat from the winter line, that question was becoming less certain with each hour. The orders that Lucas was receiving from higher command during these hours reflected the tension between different visions of what the Anzio operation should achieve. General Alexander, the overall Allied commander in the Mediterranean, wanted the Anzio forces to drive inland aggressively, to push toward the Alban Hills and cut the German supply lines that sustained the winter line. He believed that such aggressive action, even if it carried risks, would force German commanders to decide between defending against the threat to their supplies or defending against the main Allied armies pushing up the peninsula. But Lucas's orders, issued before the landing, had emphasized establishing a firm beachhead first. Some accounts suggest that Lucas received verbal guidance to push inland aggressively, but what was recorded in his operational orders was the emphasis on security and consolidation. In such circumstances, a careful commander facing genuine risks would choose security. And Lucas was careful. He had not asked for this command, had not sought the responsibility for the operation. He understood that if the beachhead was lost, if German forces pushed the Allies back into the sea, his name would be written into history as the commander who had failed. There was asymmetry in the risk calculus from his perspective. The upside of aggressive action was shared glory if it succeeded, but the downside of aggressive action was personal catastrophe if it failed. The result, almost inevitably, was consolidation rather than exploitation. The supply system that was being built during these first hours and days was itself an anchor preventing rapid movement inland. Thousands of tons of ammunition, rations, and fuel had been unloaded onto the beaches, and these supplies had to be protected, organized, and managed. Moving rapidly inland meant moving away from the beaches where supplies could be brought ashore, meant extending supply lines that were already stretched by the inherent difficulties of amphibious logistics. The doctrine of amphibious operations, developed through bitter experience in the Pacific and Sicily, emphasized the importance of securing the beachhead first, of building up supplies before embarking on aggressive operations. That doctrine existed because previous amphibious operations, where commanders had tried to exploit early success and move inland too rapidly, had sometimes ended in disaster when German or Japanese counterattacks had struck forces that were overextended and not fully supported. The caution embedded in Lucas's approach was not entirely irrational paranoia. It reflected lessons from previous campaigns. And yet, every principle of war has its counterintuitive opposite. Sometimes caution in the face of weakness is more dangerous than boldness in the face of uncertainty. Sometimes the security of the moment is surrendered in the name of establishing security for later. Sometimes the choice to consolidate position ensures that position will be consolidated in stalemate rather than broken open for exploitation. By the evening of the 23rd of January, the beachhead had been secured. No German counterattack had yet dislodged the Allies from their positions. No gap had opened in the perimeter. The German response, though growing in intensity and coordination, had not yet achieved anything approaching the massive effort that would be launched in mid-February. Lucas could reasonably believe that his caution had been justified, that the decision to consolidate rather than push inland had been vindicated by the apparent failure of German forces to achieve immediate success. The supplies were building up, the defensive positions were hardening, the reinforcements were flowing in. The beachhead that had seemed fragile on the morning of the landing was becoming more substantial by the hour. From a certain perspective, this was exactly what was supposed to happen. From another perspective, it was a tragedy playing out in real time, the slow closing of a window of opportunity that would never quite open again. The aggressive advance that might have been possible on the morning of the 22nd, when German confusion was still complete and reserves had not yet begun to arrive, would be impossible by the 23rd. By the 24th, it would be even more impossible. The beachhead was growing stronger as a fortress, but the operation was transforming from an exploitation of German weakness into something far grimmer and more costly, a grinding struggle for positional advantage in an area so small that neither side could achieve decisive victory. The golden hours had passed. The decision to consolidate had been made, and with it, the strategic possibilities of Anzio had been curtailed. At German military headquarters in northern Italy, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring received the first reports of an Allied landing near Anzio on the morning of the 22nd of January, 1944. The messenger arrived with the kind of urgency that cuts through protocol, and the news itself was both shocking and, in a peculiar way, expected. The Allies had been preparing something in the Mediterranean for weeks, their movements tracked by German intelligence, their intentions debated in countless staff meetings across the Reich. Kesselring, a professional soldier who had engineered the defensive genius of the Winter Line and turned Italy into a grinding stalemate, did not panic. Instead, he experienced something more dangerous than panic, a terrible clarity that the situation was far worse than he had believed. The Beachhead had struck not where he had positioned his reserves, but precisely where the Allies could cause the most damage. Within hours, he understood that the campaign in Italy had entered a new and far more perilous phase, one in which his army was about to be tested on two fronts simultaneously, squeezed between the advancing main Allied forces from the south and the newly landed beachhead at Anzio. The German High Command had known an amphibious assault was coming. This was not a surprise in the abstract sense. Intelligence reports from Fremde Heere West, the German military intelligence service, had accumulated warnings through December and January as the Allies massed shipping and troops in Naples and across Mediterranean ports. Naval intelligence had detected the unusual concentration of landing craft and transport vessels. Agents in occupied territory had reported increased activity and the movement of troops toward embarkation points. Yet despite these warnings, Kesselring and his superiors had made a crucial miscalculation about where the blow would fall. The prevailing opinion at German headquarters held that if an amphibious landing came, it would strike at the northern coast of Italy, perhaps near the Adriatic, or possibly target the Tyrrhenian coast farther north. Anzio, a small port south of Rome, did not fit the pattern of German strategic assumptions. The distance from the main German defensive line seemed too great for an isolated beachhead to survive. The port facilities were limited. The surrounding terrain offered no obvious strategic advantages. Military logic, which often proves to be the enemy of military success, had convinced Kesselring that an assault at Anzio would be too risky, too limited in objective, and ultimately too vulnerable to counterattack. This assumption, this act of military reasoning that seemed sound on a map, would become the foundation upon which the entire German response would rest. When the reports of the actual landing came through, Kesselring recognized at once the magnitude of the threat. The Allies had not struck where German reserves waited, but had instead cut deep behind the German lines, placing themselves between the main German army and Rome, threatening supply lines that ran northward to the German forces fighting on the Winter Line. More troubling still, the initial reports suggested that the landing had achieved complete tactical surprise. German forces in the Anzio sector were scattered and weak, positioned for observation rather than defense. The nearest German reserves were hours away, and coordinating their movement while maintaining the defense of the Winter Line against renewed pressure from the main Allied forces would require not merely military skill, but something approaching military miracles. Kesselring immediately began the process of concentrating forces, calling in units from across the occupied Italian peninsula, from Liguria in the north, from the coastal regions, and from reserves behind the Winter Line. Every division he committed to contain or crush the Anzio beachhead was a division not available to hold the main line. This was the terrible arithmetic of defense when an enemy controls the sea and can land forces where they choose. Kesselring understood that his strategic situation had fundamentally worsened between the moment he received that first report and the moment he finished reading it. But the crucial dimension of German response at this moment was not primarily Kesselring's, despite his position as field commander. Instead, control of the strategic response passed upward to Berlin, to the office of Adolf Hitler and the leadership of the German army at the Reich's highest level. Hitler had been deeply involved in Italian strategy throughout the campaign, and news of the Anzio landing reached him through military channels and then through the flow of reports that crowded his desk. The Führer's reaction was visceral and unambiguous. The beachhead could not be allowed to exist. It must be destroyed. German forces would not be pulled back or consolidated in a defensive perimeter designed to minimize losses and maintain territory. Instead, A counteroffensive of overwhelming force would be launched to annihilate the beachhead and throw the Allies back into the sea. This was Hitler's strategic vision rendered into military orders: assault, concentration of force, the elimination of weakness through the application of maximum violence. The message flowed back down from Berlin to Kesselring and to the commanders in the field, carrying Hitler's authority and the weight of the Führer's will. The operation itself was given a name: Operation Fischfang, the fishing operation, a code name suggesting the deliberate encirclement and capture of prey that German planners believed they could achieve. Kesselring, despite whatever reservations he might have harbored about the feasibility of such an undertaking, became the instrument through which Hitler's will was executed. The field marshal began the complex process of orchestrating the largest concentration of German forces that the Italian campaign had yet assembled. Units were withdrawn from the winter line, leaving skeleton garrisons to hold the line against renewed Allied pressure. Divisions from Liguria, from the Adriatic coast, from occupying forces in central Italy, began moving toward Anzio. General Eberhard von Mackensen, a capable and aggressive commander, was appointed to lead the 14th Army, which would be the primary German force committed to the counteroffensive. Von Mackensen's task was straightforward in its statement, but staggering in its complexity. Concentrate sufficient force to breach the beachhead's perimeter, encircle the trapped Allied forces, and destroy them before they could be reinforced or escape. Supporting this infantry assault would be German armor, including the formidable Tiger tanks, assault guns, and self-propelled artillery pieces. German commanders estimated that they could assemble roughly 4 to 5 divisions initially, with the possibility of committing additional forces as the offensive progressed. On paper, these forces might seem sufficient to overwhelm a beachhead that contained perhaps 4 divisions of Allied troops on the first day, but the paper reality of military calculations often bears little relationship to the reality of actual combat, and Kesselring understood this as a man who had already fought the Allies across Sicily and into Italy. The German response operated on multiple levels simultaneously in these crucial hours following the landing. At the operational level, von Mackensen and his staff began receiving the detailed orders that would shape the counteroffensive. At the logistical level, German quartermaster services scrambled to collect supplies, fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, moving them toward the assembly areas where German forces would concentrate. At the political level, Kesselring maintained communication with Berlin, updating Hitler and the German High Command on the situation and requesting the authorization for every subsequent action. And at the tactical level, German units already present in the Anzio sector began probing the beachhead's perimeter, testing Allied responses, gathering intelligence about the strength and organization of the Allied defenses. The rhythm of this response was neither panicked nor leisurely. The German army had confronted large-scale amphibious operations before, at Gallipoli in the previous war, during the invasion of France in 1940, and most recently during the invasion of Russia across the Dnieper and other river lines. German doctrine for defeating amphibious assaults emphasized speed, concentration of force, and the absolute necessity of destroying the beachhead before the enemy could build it up into an unassailable position. Speed was Germany's primary advantage, this calculus suggested. German forces, moving by rail and by road from nearby areas, could concentrate far more quickly than the Allies could reinforce their beachhead across the sea. If the Germans could attack in overwhelming strength within days of the landing, before substantial additional forces and heavy equipment reached the beachhead, the operation stood a reasonable chance of success. What German commanders could not fully appreciate at this moment was how completely the landing had altered the strategic balance. The presence of the beachhead now forced the Germans into a terrible dilemma that no amount of tactical brilliance could fully resolve. To concentrate sufficient force to attack the beachhead meant reducing the strength of the main defensive line against the advancing Allied armies from the south. To maintain the main defensive line at full strength meant attacking the beachhead with insufficient force, an effort that might fail or might succeed at such cost that the main line would collapse anyway. This was not a dilemma with a good solution. It was a situation in which all available choices led toward catastrophe, though some paths led there more quickly than others. Kesselring had to choose which disasters to prioritize, which losses to accept, which ground to sacrifice in exchange for the possibility of destroying the beachhead. The German High Command in Berlin did not particularly care about these difficult calculations. They had made their decision. The beachhead must be destroyed, and German forces in Italy would accomplish this destruction or bear the responsibility for failure. The broader strategic context made German desperation even more acute. In January 1944, Germany was fighting a three-front war: the massive Russian front in the east, the Atlantic Wall and fortifications in the west, preparing for the expected invasion, and the Mediterranean campaign in Italy. German resources were not merely limited, they were stretched to the breaking point across the entire continent. Divisions were being pulled from Italy to strengthen defences in France against the anticipated invasion. The Italian campaign had become, in the assessment of the German High Command, a secondary theatre, valuable primarily for what it prevented the Allies from doing elsewhere, but not a priority for German reinforcement. The landing at Anzio, therefore, arrived at precisely the moment when Germany's capacity to respond with overwhelming force was at its lowest. The divisions Kesselring could concentrate were largely the divisions already present in Italy, and these were not sufficient for the massive assault that Hitler demanded. Some reinforcements would arrive, but not enough, and not quickly enough to transform the military balance decisively. The German High Command in Berlin seemed to understand this only partially. Hitler's orders flowed from the Führer's absolute conviction that German will, properly applied, could overcome any obstacle. The apparent contradiction between what Hitler was demanding and what the military situation actually permitted was a gap that no one in the German chain of command dared openly acknowledge. By the evening of the 22nd of January, less than a day after the first Allied troops touched sand at Anzio, the German response was in motion. Orders had been issued, units had begun moving. Von Mackensen was establishing his headquarters and receiving the flood of information about Allied strength, disposition, and activity that would shape his planning. German commanders were estimating timelines, calculating how long it would take to assemble sufficient force, and beginning to sketch the outlines of the counteroffensive that would break the beachhead into fragments. The initial German tactical response had been confused and reactive. Local commanders had done what they could with the forces immediately available, probing and testing, rather than attacking in overwhelming strength. But within 24 hours, this tactical improvisation would give way to something far more coordinated and dangerous. The German military machine, despite its losses and its stretching across the continent, still possessed the capacity to generate large-scale military operations. The Anzio beachhead had achieved total surprise and had caught the Germans off guard, but this surprise was now being converted into information, and information was being converted into plans, and plans would soon be converted into operations. The Germans understood that they could not afford to allow the beachhead to consolidate and build up its strength indefinitely. Every day that passed, every ship that unloaded supplies, every reinforcement that landed, made the Allied position stronger and the German counteroffensive less likely to achieve decisive results. The race was now fully engaged, Could the Germans generate sufficient force and strike with sufficient speed to destroy the beachhead before it became impregnable, or would the Allies' control of the seas and their logistical advantages prove decisively superior to German mobility and concentration of force? The German response also revealed something about the nature of command in the Nazi state. Kesselring, despite his skill and experience, could not simply decide to concentrate forces where he believed they were needed most and conduct the campaign according to his professional judgment. Instead, every major decision had to flow through Berlin, had to receive Hitler's approval, had to align with the Führer's strategic vision and political objectives. This created a relationship between the field commander and the supreme political leadership that was far removed from traditional military hierarchy. Kesselring was not a subordinate in the conventional sense. He was an instrument through which Hitler's will was executed. The orders that came from Berlin were not suggestions to be modified based on conditions at the front. They were directives that must be obeyed, even when the field commander understood them to be impractical or even impossible. Hitler had declared that the beachhead would be destroyed. Kesselring now had to figure out how to accomplish this, not whether it could be accomplished. This fundamental assumption, this refusal to acknowledge that circumstances might demand something other than what the Führer had ordered, would color every German decision regarding Anzio in the weeks to come. The operation would not be conducted according to the flexible, responsive doctrine that German military tradition emphasized. Instead, it would be conducted according to Hitler's vision of how warfare should be waged. Total commitment, complete concentration of force, the absolute refusal to accept any outcome other than complete victory. Reality would prove far more stubborn than doctrine. As night fell on that first day, and into the second, the German response continued to accelerate. From across occupied Italy, from fortified positions and defensive lines, from training areas and rest camps, German units began moving toward Anzio. Rail networks that had operated at modest capacity for months suddenly erupted into activity, carrying entire divisions toward the battle. Roads that had known little more than routine supply traffic suddenly thundered under the weight of military transport moving toward the coast. The operation was no longer a matter of isolated German commanders making local decisions in response to an unexpected crisis. It had become a coordinated campaign involving the highest levels of German political and military authority. Hitler had seen the threat and had responded with the only solution his mind could generate: overwhelming force and the complete destruction of the enemy. Kesselring would execute this vision, would concentrate every resource he could spare, would launch the counter-offensive that Berlin demanded. Whether such an operation could succeed was a question that no one in the German High Command was prepared to acknowledge, let alone answer. The machinery of German war was now fully engaged, and the grinding against the Anzio beachhead would continue for months. Chapter 9: The First Counterattack. The beachhead at Anzio had existed for barely 24 hours when the first signs of organized German resistance began to materialize from the interior. The initial shock of the landing, that eerie silence, the almost unopposed rush inland, had lulled many Allied soldiers into a dangerous confidence, a belief that perhaps the Germans were truly unprepared, that the gamble had succeeded beyond expectation. But on the afternoon of the 22nd of January, as troops consolidated positions and supply dumps took shape on the narrow beaches, observers began reporting movement to the north and east. Motorcycle scouts appeared on ridgelines. Columns of vehicles could be seen through binoculars, dust rising from inland roads as German forces began their response. The war, it seemed, was about to announce itself with force. General Lucas, monitoring reports from his command post, understood what was coming. The window of opportunity, if it had ever truly existed, was closing. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding all Axis forces in Italy, had in fact been caught off guard by the Anzio landing, but only momentarily. His initial assumption had been that any major amphibious assault would come far to the north, against ports closer to Rome or beyond, not at the modest fishing village of Anzio itself. Most German reserves had been positioned to meet a thrust at Salerno or further north along the coast. Anzio seemed tactically subordinate, strategically less important. But within hours of receiving confirmation of the landing, Kesselring's staff began executing contingency plans drawn up months earlier for exactly this scenario. Orders began flowing to units across southern Italy: assemble, consolidate, and move to contain the beachhead. The machinery of German command, despite its operational disadvantages, began to turn. From the German perspective, the response was almost improvised necessity. The 14th Army, commanded by General Eberhard von Mackensen, was hastily assembling from scattered positions, drawing troops from occupation duties, from reserve formations, from anywhere available. Other units from the 10th Army, German forces facing the main Allied advance further south, were being stripped away to meet the new threat. Artillery batteries were redirected. Tank destroyers were ordered north. The Germans would not have overwhelming force, at least not immediately, but they would have enough to test the beachhead's defences and to prevent the Allies from expanding unchallenged into the surrounding countryside. The first probing attack came on the morning of the 23rd of January, delivered by German units that were still arriving and assembling, commanded by officers who had received their orders only hours earlier. These were not sustained assaults, not yet, but rather organized reconnaissance in force, an attempt to determine where the Allies had dug in, how many troops defended each sector, and whether a concentrated push might break through the lines. German infantry, moving methodically through the broken terrain near the coast, advanced in small groups, searching for gaps in the Allied perimeter. They found a beachhead that was already hardening into position. The Allies, despite their surprise fortune and the ease of the landing itself, had spent their first day doing what any competent commander would do: establishing defensive depth, positioning artillery, and preparing to repel counterattacks. Military engineers were already laying mines, constructing barriers, and creating fields of fire. Anti-tank guns were emplaced at critical points. Defensive lines, still incomplete, but growing more formidable by the hour, ringed the beachhead. When German forces advanced into these prepared positions, they encountered concentrated fire that turned their probing assaults into costly propositions. The Allies possessed overwhelming advantages in artillery and in supporting firepower from naval gunships stationed offshore. Where a German company might attack in open terrain, American or British artillery would blanket the area with shells, scattering the assault before it achieved momentum. German infantry, brave and disciplined but increasingly worn from months of fighting in Italy, pressed forward into this maelstrom, losing men in the process. By afternoon, the initial German probes had been repelled, their assault troops streaming back toward the interior, leaving dead and wounded behind. Yet the truly alarming development, from the Allied perspective, was the appearance of German armour. On the 23rd of January, the first tanks rolled toward the beachhead, and with them came a weapon system that could not be ignored or dismissed as merely reconnaissance in force. German Panther tanks, medium tanks with formidable firepower and thick armour, appeared in small numbers, 5 or 6 at first, supporting infantry attacks from prepared positions and attempting to exploit any weakness in the Allied lines. But more ominously, Tigers appeared as well. The Tiger tank had become almost mythical in its reputation. Heavily armored, mounting an 88mm main gun that could pierce most Allied armor from extreme ranges, operated by crews who had been trained to devastating effect in years of combat. To an American soldier looking across a field towards such a machine, the Tiger represented a vulnerability he could not overcome with rifle or standard anti-tank weapon. German doctrine called for using these tanks in concentrated formations, but on the 23rd of January, the Germans lacked the numerical strength for such concentration. Instead, Tigers and Panthers appeared in small groups, sometimes alone, deployed as mobile strongpoints to defend positions or to support infantry. One German Tiger, isolated and operating near the southern sector of the Beachhead, became the focus of intense Allied attention. American troops attempted to encircle the machine to find a flank or rear where anti-tank fire might penetrate armor plate. The Tiger's crew, aware of the danger, kept the machine constantly moving, never remaining in one position long enough for coordinated Allied fire to locate them precisely. The tank became a symbol of German resistance, a tangible proof that the Germans intended to fight rather than fold. American soldiers, lacking the specific training or equipment to deal with such armor, found themselves relying on artillery, on luck, and on the kind of desperate close-quarters tactics that had proven effective against armor in other theaters. Eventually, concentrated artillery fire, the same kind that was breaking German infantry assaults, proved effective against the Tiger as well. Sheer weight of fire, dozens of shells landing in the same general area, could disable or destroy even heavily armored vehicles. The Tiger near the southern sector was eventually knocked out by such a bombardment, its burning hull becoming a grim reminder that no German weapon was invulnerable if sufficient force was brought against it. The German attacks continued through the 23rd of January and into the 24th, waves of infantry assaulting different sections of the Beachhead perimeter, testing the depth of Allied defences and searching for exploitable weaknesses. These were not the frenzied, disorganized assaults of desperate men, but rather methodical attacks delivered by units that, despite their exhaustion and the speed of their assembly, maintained discipline and tactical competence. German officers would identify a sector of the Allied line, concentrate available forces, and launch an assault designed to rupture the defences and create an opening that could be exploited. When one assault faltered under fire, another would be launched to the north or south, forcing the Allies to shift reserves and maintain vigilance across the entire perimeter. The fighting had the character of a chess match played by professionals, each move calculated, each response anticipated in broad outline if not in specific detail. For the Allied soldiers in the trenches and behind the wire, the experience was grueling without being spectacular. German artillery, growing in volume as more batteries arrived and deployed, began to rain shells onto the Beachhead. Ammunition dumps were targeted, medical facilities were shelled, supply concentrations, inevitable on a narrow beachhead where every yard of space was precious, drew German fire. Casualties mounted not spectacularly, but steadily. A machine gunner killed by shrapnel, a mortar team wounded when a shell landed nearby, drivers and supply troops caught in the open when German fire suddenly swept across the beach. The beachhead began to take on the appearance of a battlefield rather than a pristine landing zone. Shell holes pockmarked the terrain. Burned-out vehicles sat abandoned in fields. The smell of cordite mixed with the salt air from the sea. The psychological pressure was immense, particularly for the newer troops who had never experienced combat. They had anticipated resistance, but the reality of artillery barrages, of armor appearing on ridgelines, of the constant threat of counterattack, surpassed their expectations and tested their nerve in ways that training could not fully replicate. Veterans, soldiers who had already survived combat in North Africa or Sicily, took on the role of steadying the inexperienced, showing by example that survival was possible, that fear could be managed, that the German attacks could be stopped if men held their positions and did their duty. The significance of these first German counterattacks was not in their immediate tactical success or failure, but in what they signified about the true nature of the operation. The era of uncontested expansion inland had ended. The era of German response, of systematic efforts to contain and then destroy the beachhead, had begun. Senior Allied commanders, reviewing reports from the beachhead and from higher command structures, began to understand that Operation Shingle, conceived as an audacious maneuver that would catch the Germans flat-footed and force a rapid German withdrawal, was instead becoming what it was never meant to be, a grinding battle of attrition where two well-trained armies would fight for every yard of ground and every hour of time. The Germans, though caught by surprise, had not panicked. They had responded with competence and increasing force. The Anzio beachhead, far from being a breakthrough, was showing every sign of becoming a battle within the larger campaign, a sideshow that might tie down forces that could have been used elsewhere, but which would not deliver the quick strategic victory that had justified its risks. By the evening of the 24th of January, as reports flowed back to General Lucas's command post, the commander understood that the window for rapid exploitation had truly closed. The beachhead held, the German attacks had been repelled, and American and British forces remained ashore in strength. But the future shape of the campaign was now apparent. Months of grinding combat, not days of maneuver. A siege of slowly shifting positions, rather than a breakthrough into open country. A test of will and logistics, as much as of tactics and courage. The first German counterattack had not broken the beachhead, but it had also not broken anything the Allies could exploit toward rapid victory. Instead, it had established what would become the fundamental character of Anzio, a hard fight for every mile, a battle that would demand everything from the men who fought it, and which would deliver far less than the planners had promised. The beachhead at Anzio, in those first hours of daylight on the 22nd of January, had achieved something that seemed almost impossible, surprise so complete that German forces had been caught flat-footed, their defences unprepared for an assault from the sea. But surprise, as every commander knows, is a weapon that loses its edge with each passing hour. By the 24th of January, as American and British troops began consolidating their positions inland from the beaches, the nature of the operation was beginning to shift. What had begun as a lightning strike, a maneuver designed to unhinge German defences through audacity and speed, was now transforming into something far more ponderous and deliberate. General Lucas, commanding the beachhead operation, understood that he held only a narrow strip of land, hemmed in by German forces that were beginning to move toward him from every direction. His priority became not exploitation of the breakthrough, but rather the methodical construction of a defensive fortress that could withstand the counterattack he knew was coming. The decision to consolidate rather than exploit would define everything that followed. Across the beachhead, which was itself only about 3 miles deep and 7 miles wide, a feverish activity took hold. Supply dumps grew larger each day as ships unloaded ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies onto beaches that were becoming increasingly crowded and complicated. Artillery positions were surveyed and marked, gun crews dug in, and ammunition distributed to forward positions. Engineer units worked to improve roads, clear mines from defensive areas, and establish the infrastructure that a modern army required to sustain itself. Thousands of soldiers who had arrived expecting to break out inland and race toward Rome or the Alban Hills found themselves instead digging foxholes, stringing barbed wire, and reinforcing defensive positions. The physical labor was exhausting, but it served a purpose. Each fortification, each gun emplacement, each ammunition cache made the beachhead incrementally more capable of resisting what was coming. Yet this very process of consolidation, logical and defensively sound as it was, surrendered something precious and irreplaceable. The window of opportunity that had existed on the morning of the 22nd of January, when German forces were disorganized and scattered, was closing with each passing day. From German headquarters, the response to the Anzio landing had been almost seismic in its urgency and scale. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, had been caught off guard by the landing site itself. German intelligence had suggested that any major amphibious operation would likely target the Gulf of Gaeta or areas closer to the main German lines, not the relatively lightly defended stretch of beach near Anzio. But within hours of receiving reports of the invasion, Kesselring understood that the beachhead threatened to become a knife driven into the rear of his entire defensive position. Hitler, receiving reports at his headquarters in East Prussia, reacted with characteristic fury and determination. The Führer issued orders that brooked no compromise and accepted no alternative outcome. The invaders were to be driven back into the sea, and the beachhead was to be eliminated entirely. This order was not merely a military objective, but a matter of supreme political importance, and every available German reserve in the theatre was to be committed to achieving this goal. The German High Command, understanding both the gravity of Hitler's expectations and the genuine threat that the beachhead represented, began orchestrating one of the most ambitious concentration of forces that the Germans could muster, given their already stretched resources across southern Italy. General Eberhard von Mackensen, a 63-year-old cavalry officer and veteran of decades of military service, was appointed to command the German 14th Army, which would be tasked with organizing and executing the counteroffensive against the beachhead. Von Mackensen was no stranger to difficult campaigns. He had served in the Great War and had spent years fighting in Russia before being transferred to Italy. He was methodical, technically competent, and possessed the kind of professional experience that the German High Command valued in moments of crisis. Under his command, German forces began pouring toward the beachhead from all directions. The 1st Parachute Corps, which had been relocated south, moved into positions to the north of the beachhead. The 26th Panzer Division, which had been resting and refitting after operations elsewhere in Italy, began moving toward the sector as well. Infantry divisions, mechanized units, heavy assault gun battalions, and artillery regiments all received orders to concentrate in the area and prepare for a coordinated offensive. The process of concentrating these forces took time. Roads were clogged, supply lines had to be established, ammunition had to be brought up, and commanders had to coordinate their movements. But with each passing day between the 24th and 30th of January, the German force around the beachhead grew larger and more capable, and the plans for the counteroffensive became more concrete and detailed. The Allies, meanwhile, were also bringing in reinforcements and building up their forces, but the mathematics of the situation were becoming increasingly unfavorable. Ships carrying replacement troops, ammunition, and supplies continued to arrive offshore and discharge their cargoes onto the already crowded beaches. The beachhead, however, had inherent constraints that no amount of determination could overcome. The space available was simply too limited for the number of men and vehicles that the operation required. Soldiers were packed into areas that offered minimal shelter from German artillery and air attack. Equipment was piled haphazardly because there was simply no room to organize it properly. The flow of supplies, while continuing, was slowing because there was nowhere to put them, and unloading ships in the face of increasing German air activity was becoming more hazardous each day. The beachhead was beginning to take on the character of a besieged fortress, with all the cramped desperation that such a situation implied. This was precisely the opposite of what the designers of Operation Shingle had imagined. The plan had called for rapid consolidation, followed by an aggressive breakout that would expand the beachhead and drive German forces into confusion and retreat. What was actually happening was the construction of a smaller, more concentrated, more vulnerable perimeter that was becoming increasingly dependent on external supply and support. The weather in late January on the Italian coast was cold and often wet, adding to the misery of troops who were living in foxholes and fighting positions with minimal shelter. Rain turned the ground into mud, making every movement more difficult and every task more exhausting. Soldiers developed trench foot and other cold-related ailments. Supply deliveries became harder to manage as rain made roads and beaches slippery and treacherous. German artillery, meanwhile, was finding the range of the beachhead with increasing accuracy. The German command had detailed maps of the beachhead area and could place fire on known positions with deadly precision. Every day brought casualties, not always in massive numbers, but steadily, relentlessly, wearing away at the force that Lucas could commit to offensive operations. The wounded accumulated in field hospitals, many requiring evacuation by sea, which further strained the already limited capacity of the transportation vessels available to the operation. Officers and soldiers alike understood that they were no longer participants in a dynamic offensive operation, but rather defenders of a precarious foothold. Between the 24th and 30th of January, the character of the combat changed subtly but significantly. German probing attacks became more frequent and more coordinated. Small units of German armor, including tanks and assault guns, began appearing at the edges of the beachhead perimeter, testing Allied defenses to find weak points and gauge the depth and sophistication of Allied fortifications. These attacks were rarely massive. They were reconnaissance by fire, efforts by von Mackensen and his subordinates to understand the Allied defensive setup and identify sectors that might be vulnerable to the main counteroffensive that was being planned. The Allies responded with defensive fire, calling in artillery and air support when German armor appeared, and these encounters, while not decisive, began establishing patterns and expectations. German forces learned where Allied firepower was concentrated and where gaps might exist. Allied forces learned to recognize the signatures of German probing attacks and to respond with coordinated defensive fire. The beachhead was beginning to acquire a kind of military equilibrium, a balance between attacker and defender that would persist for weeks. The accumulation of forces during this period was not merely a matter of men and equipment arriving at the beachhead. It was also a process of integration and coordination, of creating from disparate units and formations a cohesive fighting force capable of resisting a major offensive. New units arriving at the beachhead had to be assigned positions, integrated into existing defensive lines, supplied with ammunition and rations, and familiarized with the specific tactical situation of their sector. Officers had to coordinate with neighboring units, establish reserve positions, and identify reinforcement routes. Signal troops had to establish communication networks that could handle the volume of traffic necessary for coordinating a defense. Medical personnel had to establish aid stations and evacuation procedures. These were not glamorous tasks, but they were absolutely essential for transforming a beachhead from a confused assembly of arriving troops into an organized defensive position. Lucas, for all the criticisms that would later be leveled against his caution, was executing this consolidation phase with considerable competence. Yet beneath the surface of this methodical preparation, there existed a tension, a fundamental disagreement about what the beachhead was supposed to accomplish. Lucas's orders from his superior, General Harold Alexander, emphasized establishing a secure beachhead first and then preparing to break out and advance inland. But Alexander, and even more so General Mark Clark, who commanded the overall American forces in Italy, had been expecting and hoping for a more aggressive breakout. The hope, however unfounded it might have been in retrospect, was that Lucas would use the momentum of surprise to rapidly expand inland, push toward the Alban Hills, and cut German supply lines before German forces could coordinate an effective response. This disagreement was never directly confronted during the critical days following the landing, but it created an ambiguity that haunted the operation. Lucas was defending his caution as prudent, as the necessary foundation for sustainable operations. His superiors were beginning to worry that the beachhead was becoming static, that the moment for exploitation was passing, that the Anzio operation was in danger of becoming exactly what it had been designed to prevent: another static engagement where the Allies were forced to grind away against German defences rather than maneuvering and achieving a breakthrough. By the 28th and 29th of January, German preparations for the counteroffensive were nearing completion. Von Mackensen had concentrated substantial forces, with multiple divisions either in position or moving into position, and the coordination of their approach was being refined through detailed orders and reconnaissance. German assault gun battalions were receiving final instructions on the sectors where they would attack. Infantry divisions were being briefed on their objectives and the scope of the offensive. Ammunition supplies were being stockpiled at forward positions. German artillery was registering on known Allied positions, calculating firing data that would allow them to engage targets with minimal delay once the offensive began. The Germans were preparing for a set-piece offensive, a carefully coordinated assault designed to break through the Allied beachhead at specific points and then exploit those breakthroughs to encircle and destroy the Allied force. It was an ambitious plan, but the Germans had the forces necessary to attempt it, provided they could achieve surprise or concentration or both. For the Allies at Anzio, the period between the 24th and 30th of January had been one of consolidation and reinforcement, but also one of uncertainty and mounting pressure. The beachhead was becoming more defensible each day, but also more crowded and more dependent on supply lines that remained vulnerable to German air and naval attack. The window of opportunity that had seemed so promising on the morning of the 22nd of January had closed almost imperceptibly, a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation, but that collectively surrendered the advantage of surprise and concentration. The tempo of war at Anzio was shifting from the rapid exploitation of a successful landing to the slower, grinding attrition of a siege. German forces were concentrating and preparing to launch an assault of their own, and the beachhead was being transformed from a spearhead of maneuver into a fortress under siege. The critical decision points had passed, and what lay ahead was going to be a test of will, firepower, and endurance. Neither side could know, in those final days of January, that the beachhead would hold and ultimately become the hammer that would break through German lines. For now, it was simply a desperate foothold, growing more crowded and more precarious with each passing day, while German forces gathered in ever-increasing numbers for a strike that they hoped would erase the beachhead entirely. By the final weeks of January 1944, the Anzio beachhead had transformed from a landing zone into something far more constrained and precarious, a compressed island of humanity, machinery, and material, squeezed into a narrow strip of coastline where every meter of space carried weight and consequence. What had begun as a surprise incursion behind German lines had calcified into a vulnerable enclave, ringed by enemy forces that grew stronger and more determined with each passing day. The strategic ambition that had launched Operation Shingle, the promise of a breakthrough, a race toward Rome, a hammer blow against German defenses, had given way to a grimmer reality. Survival itself had become the primary objective. The beachhead sprawled roughly 7 miles along the coast, and perhaps 3 miles inland at its deepest point, a territory so compressed that soldiers often joked darkly about being able to spit from one end to the other and hit an officer at the other. Yet within this confined space, more than 100,000 troops were attempting to establish a foothold, dig in, supply themselves, and prepare for the German onslaught that everyone understood was coming. The irony was almost unbearable. They had landed with so little opposition, had achieved such tactical surprise, that they might have pushed far inland in those first golden hours. Now they were paying for the caution that had seemed so prudent at the time. The physical reality of the beachhead created a pressure cooker of human and material congestion that became increasingly difficult to manage as days turned into weeks. Landing craft continued to arrive, disgorging thousands more troops, hundreds of vehicles, and mountains of ammunition and supplies that had to go somewhere, be organized, and be made immediately available for the moment when German forces struck in earnest. Tanks and artillery pieces were crammed into positions that offered little room for maneuver or repositioning. Supply dumps accumulated on the beaches themselves, stacked in towering piles of ammunition boxes, fuel cans, ration containers, and medical supplies, creating a landscape that resembled less a military beachhead and more a sprawling logistics depot under combat stress. Trucks and jeeps competed for space on narrow roads carved out of the Italian countryside, creating traffic jams that would have been almost comic if the stakes were not so lethal. Officers struggled to maintain any sense of order or rational organization when every square meter of ground was contested for space, and every landing craft that arrived added exponentially to the congestion. The engineers who had come ashore to construct defensive fortifications and supply facilities found themselves working in an environment where there was barely enough room to operate, let alone establish the kind of organized rear area that a proper beachhead required. Water shortages plagued the crowded enclave, and sanitation became an immediate concern when so many men were compressed into such limited space. Artillery fire began to define the rhythm of existence on the beachhead, with a terrible regularity that no soldier would ever forget. German guns, positioned on the high ground that surrounded the beachhead on 3 sides, could reach nearly every point within the perimeter with remarkable consistency. The barrage would begin without warning, a howling through the air that sent men diving for whatever cover existed. A shell crater, a trench, behind a stack of supplies, or sometimes no cover at all, and just prostration on the ground, and the hope that the next shell would miss. The psychological toll of constant bombardment cannot be easily quantified or described to those who have not experienced it. There was no predictability, no rhythm beyond the general knowledge that artillery fire came regularly throughout the day and the night, disrupting sleep, fraying nerves, and creating a persistent undercurrent of anxiety that never fully dissipated. Soldiers learned to recognize the sound of different caliber weapons by the distinctive whistle and crack of their shells, The sharper report of the 88mm gun, the heavier boom of larger artillery pieces, the chatter of anti-aircraft fire when German planes managed to penetrate the beachhead's defences. The cumulative effect of days and weeks of bombardment began to show in the faces of men, in the 1,000-yard stare that combat veterans developed, in the trembling hands of soldiers who had witnessed too many of their comrades torn apart by shrapnel. Men developed nervous conditions, some became incapable of functioning in combat, and the beachhead's medical facilities struggled to cope with both the physical wounds of artillery and the invisible psychological wounds that artillery inflicted on the human mind. The beaches themselves became a world of organized chaos, wrapped around the logistical demands of keeping more than 100,000 troops supplied, armed, and ready for combat. Wounded men began to accumulate in field hospitals that had been established inland from the beaches, and the evacuation of these casualties became increasingly problematic as German air activity intensified and German artillery began to deliberately target the beachhead's rear areas. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, mounted sporadic but determined attacks against shipping offshore and against the beachhead itself, and while the Allies maintained air superiority during daylight hours, German fighters and fighter bombers still managed to inflict casualties and damage on the crowded beaches and anchorages. Ambulances became ubiquitous on the beachhead's narrow roads, racing wounded to field hospitals that were themselves under artillery fire and threatened by German air attack. Medical personnel worked around the clock in conditions of terrible stress, operating on wounded men in makeshift surgical facilities that offered little protection from the warfare continuing around them. The evacuation of seriously wounded men by landing craft back to North Africa became a persistent challenge, competing for space with incoming supplies and fresh troops. Soldiers on the beachhead watched their comrades being loaded onto stretchers, saw the scale of casualties mounting day after day, and understood with a clarity that no briefing could have provided that they were locked into something far more dangerous and uncertain than anyone had promised them before the landing. The compression of so many men into so little space created social and psychological pressures that went beyond the normal strains of combat. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and morale among men who were frightened, exhausted, and crammed into trenches and makeshift shelters where privacy did not exist, and personal space was an almost forgotten luxury. The constant threat of German attack created a hypervigilance that made rest nearly impossible, and soldiers survived on insufficient sleep, terrible food, and the fading hope that the beachhead might somehow break out of its stranglehold. The camaraderie that often develops among soldiers facing common danger developed here as well, but it existed alongside frustration, fear, and the growing realization that the bold plan that had seemed so promising in the planning stages had instead delivered them to a cage where they waited for German forces to come and test the strength of their defenses. Officers rotated men through the front lines to reduce the psychological toll, but there was nowhere on the beachhead that was truly safe from artillery fire, and the rotation provided only minimal relief. Soldiers hoarded letters from home, read them over and over until the paper wore thin, and wrote their own letters with the awareness that these might be the last things they ever communicated to their families. The beachhead became a place where time seemed to slow and stretch, where a single day could contain an entire emotional journey from fear to resignation to brief moments of humor or connection with other men in the same impossible situation. The German forces surrounding the beachhead were themselves beginning to accumulate and organize under the command of General Eberhard von Mackensen, who had arrived to take control of the German forces designated to destroy the Anzio beachhead. Von Mackensen was a methodical officer who understood that the Allies were vulnerable in their compressed beachhead, and he began orchestrating the arrival and positioning of reinforcements for what would become the largest German counteroffensive that German forces could mount in Italy. Infantry divisions were en route from various parts of the Italian peninsula, and German armor, including some of the formidable Tiger tanks that Allied soldiers had learned to fear, was being positioned to support the infanticide assault. German intelligence began to develop a clearer picture of Allied strength and positions within the beachhead, and German commanders began to prepare detailed plans for an offensive that they believed could shatter the Allied beachhead and drive the invading forces back into the sea. The knowledge that German forces were preparing for an all-out assault hung over the beachhead like a shadow, visible in the accelerated pace of fortification work, in the urgent efforts to stockpile ammunition, and in the tense conversations among officers who understood that the next phase of the Anzio campaign would determine whether the operation would be vindicated or would instead become a catastrophic failure that would haunt the Allies for years to come. The supply situation on the beachhead, while adequate for the moment, was precarious and vulnerable to disruption that German action might inflict. Every supply ship that arrived had to be unloaded rapidly to clear the beaches and make room for the next wave of supplies. Ammunition was the priority, but food, water, medical supplies and fuel all competed for space and transport capacity. The possibility of a serious disruption to this supply chain through German air attacks, German naval action, or damage to the beachhead's port facilities created an underlying anxiety that affected every calculation about how long the beachhead could sustain itself if German pressure became truly overwhelming. The logistics officers who managed this flow of supplies worked with the awareness that they were maintaining a lifeline to more than 100,000 men, and any failure in their calculations or any disruption to their careful planning could translate into soldiers running low on ammunition at the exact moment when enemy pressure peaked. Captured German documents would later reveal that German commanders understood this vulnerability and had discussed options for interdicting the beachhead's supplies, either through air attack or through potential naval sorties. The beachhead's vulnerability was not theoretical, but visceral and immediate, and every supply officer on the beachhead was acutely aware of how thin the margin of safety truly was. The nights on the beachhead brought their own particular torment, a darkness punctuated by German flares that illuminated the landscape in a spectral white light, and by the sound of German artillery and the occasional German air attack. Sleep became a precious commodity that was in short supply for officers and men alike. The tension of awaiting German attack, the knowledge that counteroffensive preparations were underway, and that an assault could come at almost any moment, prevented the kind of deep sleep that soldiers desperately needed to maintain their physical and mental capabilities. Men developed ritual behaviors to cope with the stress, checking weapons repeatedly, maintaining ammunition in ready positions, reinforcing foxholes and trenches with materials scavenged from around the beachhead, talking in low voices with comrades about what would happen when the Germans attacked, and whether the beachhead could be held. Some soldiers became almost mechanical in their movements, functioning on autopilot while their minds retreated to happier places and times before the war. Others became hyperactive, constantly seeking tasks to perform, unable to sit still, driven by anxiety that manifested as restless energy. The beachhead's medical officers treated cases of combat exhaustion with increasing frequency, understanding that the strain of waiting for a massive German assault was taking a toll on men even before the assault began. The relationship between the crowded beachhead and the Allies' strategic position created a paradox that grew more acute as January turned toward February. The Beachhead represented a significant achievement, an amphibious landing accomplished with relatively light casualties, a successful surprise, a foothold that the Germans had not been able to immediately eliminate. Yet the Beachhead also represented a vulnerability and a commitment, a situation where more than 100,000 men were locked into a confined space, awaiting developments that were largely beyond their control. Higher command was aware of this situation and was working on plans to break the stalemate. The main armies pushing up the peninsula were attempting to break through the winter line and eventually make contact with the Anzio beachhead. But that process would take weeks and would depend on breakthroughs that were not yet assured. Incoming supplies were being prioritized to support Anzio because everyone understood that a beachhead under siege was inherently fragile. The evacuation of non-essential personnel began, a humbling process that involved removing men who had landed with the beachhead but who were not immediately necessary for combat operations, creating space and reducing the demands on the beachhead's water and food supplies. This evacuation process created mixed emotions among those who remained. Relief for those who were leaving, resentment among those who stayed, and a general sense that the situation, while not yet desperate, was becoming increasingly precarious and uncertain. The contrast between the potential that had seemed so bright in those first hours after the landing and the grim reality of late January was almost painful to contemplate for soldiers and officers alike. The promise that had drawn men into landing craft and sent them ashore with hopes of a breakthrough had curdled into the reality of a siege, of daily bombardment, of accumulating casualties, and of waiting for a German offensive that everyone understood was coming and that would test the beachhead's fragile defenses to their limit. The conversation among soldiers, when they had time and energy for conversation, often turned to dark humor about their situation, jokes about being trapped in what was being called the smallest prison camp in Italy, gallows humor that masked genuine fear about what the coming weeks might bring. Officers received briefings that carefully outlined German strength and intentions, assessments that suggested the Germans were preparing for a massive assault and that the beachhead would be under severe threat within days or weeks. Some officers began to prepare contingency plans for the possibility of evacuation, though this prospect was regarded with almost superstitious dread. To discuss evacuation seemed to invite defeat and to acknowledge a possibility that no one wanted to contemplate. The beachhead in late January existed in a state of terrible suspension, locked between the achievement of the landing and the uncertainty of what would follow, packed with men and machines and supplies, and ringed by German forces that were massing for what they believed would be the stroke that would shatter the invasion and preserve their foothold in Italy. By the middle of February, the Anzio beachhead had become a pressure cooker. For nearly 4 weeks, Allied forces had occupied their narrow strip of Italian coastline, and in that time, German commanders had transformed shock into strategy. General Eberhard von Mackensen, commanding the German 14th Army, had assembled nearly 90,000 troops for a concentrated assault. Hitler himself had issued the directive, the beachhead must be annihilated, the invaders cast back into the sea. The German High Command had studied the beachhead's shape and dimensions, mapped its supply dumps, located its artillery positions, and identified the points where they believed the Allied defense was thinnest. They had learned the names of the American and British commanders, understood their dispositions, and calculated where the breakthrough might come. Every passing day had strengthened German preparation, while the Allies, despite their numerical advantage in the beachhead itself, remained pinned in a perimeter they could not expand and could scarcely defend with confidence. On the morning of the 16th of February, the German attack began with artillery. Before dawn, German guns opened fire across a front that stretched nearly the entire width of the beachhead, concentrating their heaviest fire on the southern sector where American forces held positions inland from the town of Anzio itself. The bombardment was not the desultory shelling that had characterized the previous weeks. This was calculated, purposeful fire, intended to break communications, destroy forward positions, and kill as many Allied soldiers as possible before the infantry assault began. Shells screamed across the frozen landscape, tearing into supply dumps and ammunition caches, killing soldiers huddled in inadequate trenches and foxholes. The beachhead, already crowded beyond comfortable capacity, became a hellscape of smoke and fragmentation. Medical personnel sprinted between positions, carrying wounded back toward field hospitals that were themselves struggling to cope with the accumulating tide of casualties. The noise was so overwhelming that many soldiers remembered only disconnected flashes of sound and destruction, the mind incapable of processing the total violence being launched. When the artillery fire lifted, German infantry came forward in waves. They moved across the frozen ground in assault formations, companies and battalions advancing together, their movements coordinated by officers who had prepared for weeks for this moment. The Americans defending the southern sector opened fire with rifles and machine guns, cutting down the leading ranks of attackers. German soldiers fell, but others pressed forward, stepping over the bodies of their comrades, closing the distance to American positions. Tank destroyers and assault guns, squat, powerful vehicles designed to punch through defensive positions, rolled forward through the attacking infantry, their guns thundering as they sought out American artillery positions and command posts. For the first time since the beachhead was established, German forces pressed the Allies with the kind of intensity and coordination that suggested they might actually accomplish what they had been ordered to do. The beachhead's defenders found themselves not merely holding a line, but fighting for their survival against an enemy that had brought overwhelming force to bear at their point of greatest vulnerability. The fighting spread across the beachhead's perimeter in waves of intensity. On the eastern side, near positions held by British forces, German regiments attacked with similar ferocity, probing for weakness, testing whether British soldiers were as resilient under pressure as they had proved in previous engagements. In the center, where the main German effort was concentrated, American units found themselves pushed back gradually, yard by yard, as German attacks crashed against their positions with increasing frequency. Counterattacks, meant to restore positions that had been lost, were launched by American reserve companies and battalions, and these turned into brutal hand-to-hand encounters, in which bayonets, entrenching tools, and grenades became the weapons of intimate warfare. Soldiers who had trained for months, who had survived the landing itself, now faced the terrifying reality that they might be overwhelmed, that their line might break, and that the beachhead they had fought so hard to establish might collapse into chaos and evacuation. As morning turned toward afternoon, the weight of the German assault seemed to be approaching a crescendo. Some American units reported that they were running low on ammunition. Others indicated that their positions had been surrounded and that they were considering withdrawal. At one point, German forces drove a significant wedge into the American line, creating a gap that threatened to split the beachhead's defenders into separated fragments that could be defeated in detail. Divisional and corps commanders watched this unfolding crisis from their command posts with growing alarm. Reports flooded in describing the intensity of German attacks, the penetration of German forces, and the exhaustion of American units that had now been fighting continuously for hours without relief. For several terrible hours, the outcome of the battle hung in genuine balance. The possibility that the beachhead would be shattered, that tens of thousands of Allied soldiers would be killed, captured, or forced into the sea, was not an abstract military contingency. It was a real and present danger that senior commanders had to contemplate seriously. The turning point came through concentration of firepower. General Lucas, despite his caution regarding breakout operations, understood that the immediate crisis required committing all available reserves immediately. American units that had been held in reserve were ordered forward, moved into gaps in the line, and committed to counterattacks designed to stop the German penetration and restore the integrity of the defensive perimeter. More significantly, Allied commanders realized that German forces attacking across open ground were vulnerable to concentrated artillery fire. The beachhead, despite its limitations, had been built with artillery in mind. American and British artillery batteries positioned across the beachhead where they could support the entire perimeter began firing with methodical precision at German formations caught in the open. These were not scattered interdiction missions. They were devastating concentrations of fire, multiple batteries coordinating on single targets, creating killing zones that German infantry attempting to advance had to cross. The naval gunfire support that had seemed almost miraculous at the beachhead's establishment now proved its true worth. Offshore, American and British warships received calls for fire from spotters ashore and began launching shells that could travel far inland, striking German assembly areas, reinforcing positions, and concentrating German forces attempting to mass for assaults. The cruisers and destroyers offshore, their guns of 4-inch, 5-inch, and larger calibers, poured shells into German positions with a regularity and intensity that no land-based artillery unit could sustain. A German officer, captured later in the war, described the naval gunfire as something beyond the ordinary experience of warfare, shells arriving from an invisible source beyond the horizon, transforming entire areas into smoking rubble within minutes. German soldiers, trained to advance against fortified positions and artillery fire, were not trained to advance against the kind of coordinated firepower that the Allies could bring to bear. The German attacks began to lose momentum as the casualties mounted and the German assault formations, compressed by artillery fire, became even more vulnerable to the next volley. By late afternoon of the 16th of February, the German offensive had begun to falter. The initial waves of attacks, which had driven deep into American positions and created moments of genuine crisis, had expended themselves against a defense that, while bent and pushed backward in places, had not broken. American counterattacks, supported by fresh reserves and covered by concentrated artillery fire, began to reclaim lost ground. German commanders, observing that the breakthrough they had counted on was not materializing, made the decision to consolidate their gains and continue the attack the following day, believing that attrition would eventually wear down the Allied defense. The beachhead's perimeter had been pushed inward in some places, creating a situation even more claustrophobic than before, but the fundamental integrity of the defense had held. When darkness fell on the 16th of February, both sides understood that the crisis was not resolved, but merely postponed until the next dawn brought new attacks. The 17th of February saw German forces renew their offensive with similar intensity but diminishing numbers. The attacks continued along the entire perimeter, but now the rhythm was noticeably different. German units had absorbed heavy casualties on the previous day, and the replacements brought forward from division reserves were often men with less training and experience than those they were replacing. American artillery, now prepared for the attacks, was positioned more precisely and fired with greater effect. The German assault formations, still formidable and still dangerous, seemed to strike against an increasingly solid defense that would not yield as much ground as it had surrendered on the first day. The fighting remained brutal and intimate, men fighting in trenches that had become filled with frozen mud and human remains, grenades and rifle fire at close quarters, the smell of cordite and blood hanging over everything. But the scale had shifted subtly toward the Allies, not through any single decisive blow, but through the grinding accumulation of advantages, the defense in depth they had established, the artillery support they could concentrate, the naval gunfire available to them, and the simple fact that they were defending prepared positions against attackers moving across open ground. By the 18th of February, German commanders recognized that their offensive, despite its ferocity and scale, was not achieving its objective. The beachhead remained intact, the Allied defense had not shattered, and German casualties were mounting at a rate that could not be sustained. General von Mackensen ordered his forces to shift from offensive operations designed to destroy the beachhead to defensive positions designed to contain it. The change came not because the German soldiers lacked courage or because their commanders lacked skill, but because the fundamental equation of the battle had shifted. The Allies had more men in the beachhead than German forces could concentrate against them. The Allies had artillery and naval gunfire support that German forces simply could not match. The Allies were defending, and defending a narrow perimeter required fewer casualties than attacking across open ground against fortified positions and massed firepower. The storm that had threatened to sweep the Allies into the sea had broken against a defense that, while badly battered and compressed further, had held. The aftermath of the German offensive transformed the nature of the Anzio campaign. From mid-February onward, the beachhead was no longer under threat of immediate destruction, but it also became clear that it would not be a launching point for rapid breakout operations. Instead, a grinding stalemate settled over Anzio, a siege that would persist for months, with German and Allied forces facing each other across lines that barely moved. The beachhead that had promised to outflank the German defensive lines and threaten their communications had instead become itself a trap, a confined space where tens of thousands of Allied soldiers endured constant bombardment, limited supplies, poor conditions, and the prospect of remaining locked in stalemate until the main Allied armies advancing from the south could eventually break through and link up. The operation had transformed from bold maneuver into attrition warfare, with no end in sight, and no clear path to the rapid victory that planners had originally envisioned. The 16th of February dawned grey and cold over the Anzio beachhead, and with it came the realization that the moment of greatest peril had arrived. German forces under General Eberhard von Mackensen had massed their strength for what they believed would be the final blow, an all-out assault designed not to probe the Allied lines, but to shatter them utterly, to drive a wedge so deep that the entire beachhead would unravel and collapse into the sea. The German commanders understood that time had turned against them. Every day the Allies remained ashore, more reinforcements arrived, more supplies accumulated, and the beachhead grew harder to dislodge. This offensive, given the name Unternehmen Fischfang, or Operation Fishing, represented everything von Mackensen could throw at the narrow perimeter. Infantry divisions advancing in dense formations, armor concentrated to break through the weakest points, and artillery trying to saturate the Allied defensive positions with shell fire so intense that no man could survive it. As the German assault began that February morning, waves of infantry emerged from the mist and rain, moving toward the Allied lines with the methodical determination of men who believed they were executing Hitler's direct command. The beachhead, never more than 3 miles deep and roughly 7 miles wide, suddenly seemed even smaller as thousands of German soldiers converged on every sector of the perimeter. The sound of the attack was overwhelming. The crack of rifles, the metallic chatter of machine guns, the deeper boom of mortar fire, and beneath it all the constant thunder of artillery as both sides poured shell after shell into the compressed space between the lines. American and British soldiers, already worn and exhausted from days of constant bombardment and smaller probing attacks, braced themselves in their foxholes and trenches, knowing that what was coming would test them in ways they could scarcely imagine. Some men prayed, others simply gripped their weapons tighter and waited for the grey shapes to emerge from the smoke and chaos. The Beachhead defenders were not fresh troops. They were soldiers who had already seen weeks of continuous combat, who had watched friends die from artillery fire and machine gun bullets, who knew with stark clarity that survival was not guaranteed and that today might be the day everything fell apart. The German attacks came in echelon, pushing against different sectors of the perimeter in attempts to find the weak point that would crack the entire defensive system. One thrust struck heavily against the British sector to the south, where Commonwealth troops fought with grim determination to hold villages and defensive positions that had become the anchor of the Allied line. Another wave hit the American sector to the north, where units dug in among the rough terrain and farmland struggled to contain the pressure. A third prong pushed directly toward the center of the beachhead, where German commanders hoped to split the Allied forces and create conditions for encirclement. For the first hours of the assault, the outcome remained genuinely uncertain. The German attacks had weight and momentum, and in places along the line, German infantry managed to penetrate the first tier of Allied defensive positions and establish themselves in hand-to-hand fighting. Small groups of German soldiers pushed forward with grenades and rifles, desperate to drive a breakthrough before Allied reinforcements could be brought to bear. The noise was deafening, the smoke so thick that men could barely see more than a few dozen yards, and the chaos was so complete that for brief periods it seemed that the German offensive might actually achieve what its commanders had promised, the destruction of the beachhead. Yet even as German infantry made tactical gains and pushed into the contested ground between the main lines, a different form of firepower was beginning to assert itself with devastating effect. The Allies possessed an advantage that the Germans simply could not match: concentrated artillery and, more crucially, the guns of the supporting naval fleet anchored offshore. Naval gunfire support had been critical throughout the Anzio campaign, providing firepower that could reach deep into German positions and deliver shells of enormous destructive power with precision that land-based artillery often could not match. As the German offensive unfolded and reports came back of the locations of attacking formations, Allied officers began coordinating naval gunfire with stunning accuracy. The guns of the British cruiser Orion, the American cruisers like the Philadelphia, and the destroyers escorting the larger vessels turned to engage German infantry caught in the open ground between the beachhead's defensive lines and the German starting positions. The effect was not merely destructive, it was catastrophic. Shells weighing hundreds of pounds fell among dense formations of German infantrymen advancing shoulder to shoulder, the explosions scattering bodies and equipment across the landscape, the sheer noise and concussive force enough to stun survivors into temporary paralysis. What made the naval gunfire particularly effective was the coordination that developed between forward observers on the beachhead and the gunnery officers aboard ship. These forward observers, officers and men who crouched in advanced positions with radios and binoculars, had a clear view of German movement and could call down fire with remarkable precision. When a German company would begin to advance across a piece of open ground, within minutes shells from the guns offshore would begin to fall precisely where that company was moving. The effect on German morale was immense. Men who had been willing to face the machine guns and rifles of the ground defenders found themselves subjected to a form of firepower they could neither see nor effectively counter. Artillery, after all, came from somewhere visible if you looked hard enough, but the guns offshore, they could rain death from any direction, and there was no position that seemed safe from their reach. German commanders began to realize that their offensive was encountering something more than just stubborn ground defenders. They were facing a form of firepower concentration that their own army, stretched thin across the entire Italian campaign, simply could not match. The turning point was not a single moment, but rather a succession of hours, during which the momentum shifted almost imperceptibly from the German assault toward Allied consolidation and defense. By the afternoon of the 16th of February, German attacks that had earlier achieved local penetrations began to lose their driving force. The casualty lists were devastating. German regiments had taken 50% losses or more, and the survivors were exhausted, demoralized by the constant artillery fire, and increasingly aware that their assault was not achieving the breakthrough their commanders had promised. Meanwhile, Allied reinforcements were arriving at critical points along the line, fresh units moving into position to replace the most heavily battered defenders and to strengthen the perimeter at locations where German pressure was most intense. The mathematics of the battlefield were becoming increasingly clear. The Allies, despite their compressed position, could concentrate firepower faster than the Germans could concentrate attacking troops, and every German regiment that was shot to pieces in the assault was a regiment that could not be replaced. The 16th of February turned into the 17th, and German attacks continued, but with noticeably less coordination and enthusiasm than before. The shock and surprise that had marked the opening of the offensive had dissipated. Now the German assaults took on the character of desperate hammer blows, attempts to achieve a breakthrough through sheer repetition, even as it became clear that each repetition would only add to the casualty count without bringing victory closer. The weather, too, was beginning to break in the Allies' favor. The rain and clouds that had initially helped mask German movements were clearing, and with clearer skies came better visibility for the naval gunfire spotters, and better flying weather for Allied aircraft, which began to appear over the beachhead and add their own firepower to the devastating concentration the Germans were facing. The Luftwaffe, already heavily committed elsewhere and lacking the strength to establish air superiority, could offer minimal interference with these aircraft. The turning point crystallized on the 18th of February, when German High Command finally acknowledged that Unternehmen Fischfang had failed to achieve its objective. The assault had cost German forces tens of thousands of casualties, men who had been killed, wounded, or rendered combat ineffective by the constant bombardment. Regiments that had begun the offensive at near full strength now counted themselves fortunate to have a few hundred combat-effective soldiers remaining. German commanders who had believed that the Allies, squeezed into their narrow beachhead and demoralized by the constant pressure, would collapse under a determined assault, found instead that they had run into a defensive wall that, while battered and bleeding, had held firm. The German army, despite achieving local tactical successes in the early hours of the assault, had not achieved the decisive breakthrough that would have allowed von Mackensen's forces to envelope and destroy the beachhead. The strategy of overwhelming force applied to a concentrated objective had not worked against an enemy that could concentrate its firepower even more effectively than the Germans could concentrate their infantry. What the failure of the German offensive revealed was a fundamental imbalance in the Anzio campaign that would shape everything that followed. The Allies, despite the precariousness of their position, possessed advantages that their earlier caution had allowed them to develop and consolidate. The beachhead was defensible, not comfortable, not spacious, but defensible. The troops defending it had dug in, had established firing positions, had learned their terrain, and had familiarized themselves with the positions of their neighbors in the line. Most crucially, they had firepower, not just from their rifles and machine guns, but from the seemingly endless stream of artillery fire that could be called down from positions throughout the beachhead, and from the naval guns that seemed to appear whenever and wherever they were needed. The Germans, by contrast, were fighting from positions further back, were advancing across open ground where they were exposed to this firepower, and were doing so with formations that, while brave and well-trained, were not sufficient to overcome the defensive advantages that the Allies had created. The human dimension of the turning point cannot be ignored either. The soldiers defending the Anzio beachhead on the 18th of February were not heroes in any supernatural sense. Many were terrified, many were exhausted, and many had already suffered wounds or lost friends. Yet they held their positions. When German infantry attacked their sector, they returned fire and they did not break. When German armor appeared, they found anti-tank positions waiting for them, and they either turned back or were destroyed. The Allied commanders, whatever their limitations, had proven capable of coordinating firepower and positioning reserves in ways that countered the German offensive. General Lucas, so often criticized for his caution, had at least created a defensive structure that was tight enough to contain the German assault. The British units in the south and the American units in the north had proven capable of sustaining casualties and maintaining unit cohesion under pressure that would have broken lesser forces. By the 19th and 20th of February, the German offensive had become little more than a series of small probing attacks, local assaults without the weight and coordination that had characterized the initial assault. German commanders were already preparing orders for a shift from offensive to defensive operations, from attempting to destroy the beachhead to simply containing it. The German 10th Army and the forces under von Mackensen would remain in the hills overlooking Anzio, would continue to bombard the beachhead with artillery, would continue to probe for weakness, but would no longer maintain the fiction that the beachhead could be driven into the sea. The moment of greatest peril had passed, and while the beachhead remained under siege, compressed and vulnerable to artillery fire, it had proven that it could not be eliminated by assault alone. The Allies, having survived what was arguably the most serious challenge to the beachhead's survival, had earned the right to think not of evacuation or collapse, but of eventual breakthrough and exploitation. The failure of the German offensive represented something more significant than simply a missed opportunity for von Mackensen or a defensive success for the Allies. It was the moment when the Anzio beachhead transitioned from a desperate gamble whose outcome hung in the balance to a secured, if still perilous, position from which future operations could be mounted. The concentration of firepower that the Allies had managed to achieve, despite their confined space and limited resources, had proven decisive. The German army, despite its reputation for organization and tactical competence, had been unable to overcome defenders who possessed superior firepower and who were willing to use it with devastating effect. The irony was bitter. The very caution that General Lucas had exercised in the first days after the landing, the caution that had drawn criticism from his superiors for failing to immediately push inland and cut German supply lines, had ultimately created the conditions for the beachhead to survive its greatest test. Had the beachhead been more stretched out, with forces advanced further inland and less consolidated, it might have been far more vulnerable to the German offensive that came. The cost in human lives had been appalling on both sides, but the outcome was clear. Anzio would endure. The German offensive of mid-February had broken against the granite resistance of the Allied beachhead like a wave against a cliff face. By the 18th of February, the momentum that had promised encirclement and destruction had simply evaporated, dispersed into the cold Italian air and the scorched ground where thousands of German soldiers lay dead or dying in the attempt. General von Mackensen's 14th Army had committed its reserves, thrown its armor into the grinding machinery of Allied defense, and for all that sacrifice had gained nothing but casualties. The great counteroffensive that Hitler himself had demanded, the assault that was meant to erase the beachhead from the map, had failed, not through timidity or lack of courage, but through the simple mathematics of firepower meeting flesh and bone in a contest where firepower held every advantage. As twilight fell across the beachhead on that cold February evening, the nature of the struggle fundamentally changed. The Germans abandoned the dream of destruction and settled instead for the grimmer work of containment, transforming Anzio from a battlefield of maneuver into something else entirely, a siege. The beachhead now became a prison yard, ringed by German forces but no longer assaulted with the ferocity of men convinced they could break through in a single concentrated effort. Instead, the German High Command established a perimeter defense that would gradually tighten like a noose, designed not to destroy in one dramatic blow, but to slowly strangle, to wear down through constant pressure, to make the very act of surviving on that tiny strip of Italian coast a battle in itself. From the high ground surrounding the beachhead, German artillery positions dominated every corner of the Allied enclave, turning the interior into a place where nowhere was truly safe from shells. The German army remained committed to preventing any breakout, to ensuring that the Allies remained locked in their narrow confines, and to inflicting maximum casualties on troops packed too closely together in an area that had never been meant to accommodate so many men and machines for so long. The siege was not one of starvation. Allied supply ships still ran the gauntlet of enemy air and naval attacks to deliver provisions and ammunition, but rather one of attrition and psychological pressure, a grinding war of erosion where each day brought new death and destruction, but no change in the fundamental situation. The physical geography of the beachhead transformed it into a perfect cauldron for this kind of siege warfare. The entire perimeter stretched only roughly 7 miles along the coast and extended inland at its deepest for perhaps 3 miles, creating a space that felt less like a military beachhead and more like a crowded urban slum compressed into the dimensions of a large estate. More than 100,000 troops were packed into this confined area, along with tens of thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, ammunition dumps, fuel supplies, field hospitals, command posts, and all the logistical apparatus required to sustain and supply such a force. The roads, never abundant to begin with, became rivers of traffic congestion, with vehicles bumper to bumper waiting to move or be unloaded. The beaches themselves were transformed into mountains of supplies stacked under camouflage nets, waiting to be hauled inland or distributed to units in the line. There was simply nowhere to hide, nowhere to disperse, nowhere to achieve the spacing that would have made the army less vulnerable to artillery fire. Any German gunner with a map and basic mathematics could drop shells into the beachhead almost at random and have a reasonable chance of hitting something important or killing someone valuable. The artillery bombardment became the signature of the siege, a constant presence that filled every day with the rhythm of explosion and destruction. German guns, positioned on the high ground that rimmed the beachhead, maintained a schedule of fire that was sometimes frantic and sometimes methodical, but always present. The shells came without warning, sudden violence that tore up the frozen ground and turned vehicles into twisted wreckage, and men into fragments of what they had been. The soldiers who lived through this constant threat developed a particular kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of active combat, but rather the exhaustion of living under sentence of death, never knowing if the next moment would bring another avalanche of steel and high explosive. Veterans who survived would later describe the beachhead not as a place where they had fought, but as a place where they had simply waited to be killed, where survival was a matter of luck and nerve, where the only comfort was that eventually, somehow, you would be evacuated or rotated to the rear. The psychological toll of this persistent threat was as debilitating as the physical casualties, creating a population of traumatized men whose nerves had been stripped raw by weeks of constant danger. The German Air Force, though rapidly declining in overall capability, maintained enough strength to add another layer of terror to the beachhead experience. Luftwaffe fighters attacked in sporadic fashion, striking at shipping in the harbor, bombing supply concentrations, and strafing troops in the open. The Allied fighter cover was strong and getting stronger, but gaps existed through which German planes could slip, and each successful attack reinforced the sense that nowhere on the beachhead was truly secure. Night became the German Air Force's preferred time of operations, with bombers arriving under cover of darkness to drop their loads on the clustered targets below. Anti-aircraft defenses, though formidable, could not prevent all attacks, and losses mounted steadily. The constant threat of air attack meant that supplies had to be dispersed rather than concentrated, that troops needed to remain in shelters rather than out in the open preparing positions, and that the entire population of the beachhead lived in a state of ambient fear punctuated by moments of acute terror. Supply became a constant struggle, though perhaps not in the traditional sense of siege warfare, where defenders are slowly starved into submission. Rather, the challenge was logistical rather than absolute. The beachhead had to be supplied entirely by sea, a voyage that took ships through waters where German submarines still operated, and where German aircraft remained a threat. The narrow harbour at Anzio could only accommodate so many vessels at a time, and the beaches themselves could only sustain so much unloading activity before congestion became counterproductive. The Allies developed an intricate rotation system, with supply ships arriving, being unloaded, and departing within a narrow window of time, calculated to minimize their exposure to attack. Losses were accepted as an inevitable cost of maintaining the beachhead, and supply officers became masters of improvisation and efficiency, squeezing every possible ton of goods into every available vessel. The beachhead never suffered from genuine supply shortage. The Americans and British could afford to lose ships, and the steady stream of replacements meant that no critical lack of food, ammunition, or fuel ever developed. But the constant strain of maintaining these supply lines, the losses that did occur, and the vulnerability they represented, created a permanent sense of fragility. The wounded presented an ongoing crisis that complicated every aspect of beachhead operations. The medical facilities available on the beachhead were stretched to absolute limits, with field hospitals operating under constant artillery fire and under constant pressure to evacuate patients to make room for new casualties. The rate of casualties exceeded what could be easily evacuated by the available transport, meaning that thousands of wounded accumulated in makeshift hospitals, waiting for ships to carry them back to rear areas or to surgical facilities in North Africa. Every man lying on a stretcher in a hospital tent was a proof of the grinding intensity of life on the beachhead, and the sight of ambulances constantly running from the aid stations to the evacuation points became a permanent feature of the landscape. The medical personnel themselves, operating under constant stress and in conditions that were far from ideal, developed a kind of hardened compassion, learning to triage, to make decisions about who would be evacuated first, and to operate with the knowledge that they would never see most of their patients recover. The presence of so much suffering, so much visible pain and loss, had a psychological effect on the entire Beachhead population that went beyond the mere statistics of casualties. The ground warfare around the perimeter, though lacking the intensity of the mid-February offensive, never entirely ceased. German forces maintained constant pressure on the Allied lines, probing for weakness, launching local counterattacks designed to improve their positions or inflict casualties on exposed Allied units. American and British troops, meanwhile, worked constantly to improve their defensive positions, digging deeper trenches, strengthening wire obstacles, and positioning supporting fire to cover every approach. The fighting remained vicious and personal, with frequent patrol actions, occasional assaults on particular positions, and constant sniping and harassment. The front lines at Anzio lacked the static quality that would later characterize the Western Front after the breakout from Normandy. Instead, they seethed with activity, with constant small-scale actions that ate away at both armies. Neither side could afford to be passive. The Germans because they needed to keep the Allies pinned down and demoralized, the Allies because allowing German forces to consolidate their positions would make eventual breakout even more difficult. The monotony of siege life was broken by periods of intense fear and violent action, creating a peculiar rhythm that characterized existence on the beachhead. Morning might bring a relative calm, with men cleaning weapons, writing letters home, or attempting to catch sleep in whatever shelter they had fashioned. By afternoon, a German barrage might begin, forcing everyone into trenches and bunkers for hours, while shells tore up the landscape above their heads. Nighttime brought the possibility of infiltration or counterattack, requiring men to remain alert, weapons ready, knowing that at any moment German soldiers might emerge from the darkness. This cycle repeated endlessly through February and into March, wearing down the nerves and endurance of every man on the beachhead. Those who had been there since the initial landing had now been living under these conditions for weeks, an eternity in combat terms, and the cumulative effect was visible in their faces. Hollow-eyed exhaustion, a kind of thousand-yard stare that suggested they had seen enough death and danger to last several lifetimes. Neither the German High Command nor the Allied leadership was satisfied with the stalemate, yet neither could find a way to break it without accepting casualty rates that went beyond what could be justified by any strategic gain. The Germans lacked sufficient reserves to mount another offensive on the scale of the mid-February attempt, and their commitment to defending positions across the rest of Italy meant that Anzio could never receive the full weight of German military resources. The Allies, meanwhile, were constrained by the finite number of reinforcements that could be transported across the Mediterranean and by the vulnerability of anything they attempted within the narrow confines of the beachhead. General Lucas remained in command of the beachhead forces, but his influence over the larger strategic situation was limited. Decisions about when and how to attempt a breakout involved commanders at higher levels, and coordinating any breakout with the main Allied armies advancing up the peninsula required careful planning and precise timing. The beachhead had become a backwater in the larger Italian campaign, important enough to maintain, but not important enough to receive the resources or attention that might have allowed either side to achieve decisive results. The passage from February into March saw the situation solidify into something that resembled a stalemate more closely than anything that had come before. The German siege lines consolidated, becoming stronger and more organized with each passing week. The Allies reinforced their positions, prepared defensive works of increasing sophistication, and positioned their reserves to respond to any German attempt to exploit weakness in the perimeter. Casualties continued to mount on both sides, but at a rate that neither army found intolerable. The grinding attrition of siege warfare rather than the catastrophic losses of the mid-February offensive. The beachhead remained crowded, uncomfortable, and under constant threat, but it had become stable in its instability, locked in a situation where the status quo could be maintained indefinitely, as long as either side was willing to continue accepting steady losses without expecting change. The significance of this shift from attempted breakthrough to stalemate cannot be overstated in understanding how the Anzio operation evolved from its initial promise into something far more costly and far less decisive than its planners had hoped. The February offensive had been Germany's last genuine opportunity to erase the beachhead from the map, to achieve what Hitler had demanded, and what strategic logic suggested might be possible if the assault had come in the opening days after the landing, when the Allies were still disorganized and the beachhead was even more crowded and vulnerable than it would become later. The failure of that offensive meant that Anzio would continue to exist, would continue to drain German resources and attention, and would eventually become part of a broader strategy that would help destroy German forces in Italy. Yet that eventual success came only after months of grinding siege, only after many thousands of men on both sides had died or been wounded in a struggle for a patch of Italian shore that would be abandoned as soon as the broader military situation made its seizure unnecessary. The stalemate represented the transformation of Anzio from audacity into ordeal, from strategic maneuver into attrition, from an operation meant to be decisive into something that resembled a medieval siege in its grinding, merciless determination to break through sheer persistence rather than brilliant maneuver. While the beachhead at Anzio remained locked in its suffocating stalemate through the winter months, a different drama was unfolding in the mountains and valleys to the south. The main Allied armies, those that had pushed up the Italian peninsula from Sicily and Salerno, were finally beginning to crack through the defensive positions that had held them at bay for so long. The winter line, that formidable barrier of German fortifications and mountain strongholds stretching across the narrowest part of the Italian peninsula, had become the grinding stone upon which the Allies had sharpened their will and exhausted their patience. For months, commanders and soldiers alike had questioned whether the price in blood and time was worth the few kilometers gained, whether attrition was simply the only strategy available to armies fighting across terrain designed by geography itself to favor the defender. Yet by spring, the accumulated pressure of repeated assaults, the grinding away of German reserves, and the slow accumulation of Allied strength began to produce the first genuine cracks in what had seemed an impregnable wall. General Alexander, commanding the entire Mediterranean theatre, had come to understand that the winter line could not be breached by frontal assault alone, no matter how many times the order was given or how many divisions threw themselves against it. The answer, he believed, lay in the convergence of two armies separated by weeks of brutal mountain climbing and German defensive firepower. The plan that began to take shape in the spring of 1944 was audacious in its scope and timing. While the beachhead remained trapped and contained, the main armies advancing from the south would launch a coordinated offensive designed to achieve what had eluded them for months, a decisive breakthrough. This was not to be a limited assault on a single fortification or a contested mountain pass. Instead, Alexander envisioned a campaign of sufficient force and momentum to shatter the German defensive line entirely, to tear open the front so completely that German forces would be forced to retreat northward or face the possibility of encirclement. The coordination of such an operation across difficult terrain, with armies separated by German-held territory and the rugged Apennine Mountains, required precise planning, careful timing, and the commitment of every available reserve and reinforcement. The French Expeditionary Corps, which had suffered and fought for months in the mountains, was to play a critical role, as were American divisions fresh from North Africa and seasoned British units that had been grinding away at the German positions since the landings at Salerno. The offensive would be named Diadem, and it would represent the largest coordinated military operation the Allies had yet attempted on the Italian mainland. Success would mean not merely territorial gain, but the potential for the very strategic victory that Anzio had been designed to deliver 4 months earlier, the encirclement and destruction of German forces rather than their continued withdrawal northward. Through April and into May, as the Beachhead continued its grim endurance, the armies preparing to launch Diadem accumulated strength and supplies in the mountains. Artillery batteries were hauled into positions from which they could support the offensive. Thousands of tons of ammunition were moved forward along narrow mountain roads, and reinforcements poured into the sector. American and British commanders studied the German positions with fresh intensity, identifying not just the strongholds that would be attacked directly, but the routes by which German reserves might be forced to move, and the weak points that might be exploited if the initial assault succeeded. The soldiers themselves, many of whom had spent months in the mountains, fighting for single ridgelines and barely defensible positions, began to sense that something different was being prepared. The scale of preparation, the accumulation of supplies beyond what was needed merely for defensive positions, the arrival of fresh divisions and corps headquarters, all of it suggested that the grinding war of attrition was about to give way to something more decisive. Yet soldiers who had learned to survive in the mountains also understood the risks. The mountains around Anzio and beyond had taught hard lessons about the margin between success and disaster, about how quickly an offensive could stall and how easily momentum could be lost. The men moving into assembly areas in May carried not just weapons, but the hard-won knowledge that even the best plan could unravel in the face of German determination and the unforgiving terrain. General Alexander's strategy was built upon a foundation of hard-earned understanding about how German forces in Italy actually fought and moved. Rather than attempting to break through at the strongest points in the German line, the offensive would target specific sectors where breakthrough seemed most achievable, then exploit success ruthlessly before German reserves could be repositioned to seal the gap. The French forces, fighting with renewed vigor and a deep desire to demonstrate French military capability, were tasked with attacking in the mountains south and west of the main German positions, threatening to outflank and encircle German defenders in that sector. American forces would assault frontally, but with overwhelming concentration of force, using artillery and air support to break down German defensive positions before infantry went forward. British and Canadian forces were to maintain pressure on the main German line while being prepared to exploit any breakthrough that the Americans achieved. The entire operation was designed to create multiple points of pressure simultaneously, preventing German commanders from concentrating their limited reserves at any single threatened sector. If the operation succeeded, German forces would find themselves not simply pushed back, but potentially surrounded, cut off from lines of retreat, facing the possibility of complete destruction rather than orderly withdrawal. This was the theory, at least, and it was based upon the bitter experience of months of fighting that had taught the Allies what German forces could endure and where they might finally break. By mid-May, the offensive was ready, and the Allies, for once, possessed a significant numerical advantage at the point of contact. The Germans, stretched across the entire peninsula and unable to concentrate sufficient reserves, were aware that an attack was coming, but uncertain of its exact scale or timing. Some German commanders still believed the main effort would come from the north, or that Anzio remained the priority, that the secondary attacks in the mountains were merely diversions. Others sensed correctly that the convergence of the beachhead and the main armies represented a fundamental change in the strategic situation, but by then, the German command structure lacked the reserves or mobility to respond decisively. The offensive that began in May would prove different from the grinding, casualty-filled battles that had characterized the Italian campaign. It would still be costly. Mountain warfare remained mountain warfare regardless of the strategic objective, but it would have momentum, and momentum was what had been missing from the Italian campaign since the first days after the Sicily landings. As American, British, French, and Canadian divisions moved into attack on the 15th of May, the artillery preparation behind the offensive was among the heaviest, yet concentrated in the Italian campaign. Guns of every caliber that the Allies could position fired in coordinated barrages, tearing into German defensive positions, destroying fortifications, and killing defenders in the trenches and bunkers that had provided security through the winter months. The offensive was launched with an intensity that suggested the Allies had finally accumulated sufficient resources to break German resistance through firepower rather than attrition alone. German defenders, some of whom had held their positions since autumn, found themselves under assault from multiple directions, their fortifications damaged or destroyed by bombardment, their reserves committed piecemeal to counterattacks that could not succeed. The breakthrough, when it came, was not instantaneous. The mountains of Italy did not surrender their secrets easily, but it was real. American forces punched through in their sector. British and Canadian forces advanced, and the French, fighting with particular ferocity in terrain that reminded them of the Alps, drove deep into the German lines. Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, found himself facing the scenario he had feared since the beginning of the campaign: simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, with no reserves available to stem the tide. The coordination required between armies spread across difficult terrain was extraordinary, and its success represented a culmination of months of painful learning in Mediterranean warfare. Radio communications linked divisional headquarters to corps commands to armies, allowing commanders to shift resources and adjust the offensive in real time. Supply lines that had seemed impossibly fragile in the mountains proved capable of sustaining the offensive's momentum. Air superiority, something the Allies had taken for granted, but which was crucial in preventing German reserves from moving freely or massing for counterattack, was maintained by fighter bombers and escort fighters that ranged across the battlefield. The Allies, for the first time in the Italian campaign, had achieved the combination of numbers, firepower, coordination, and timing that allowed them to attack German positions in a way that could not be contained by tactical adjustments and local counterattacks alone. By the 19th of May, German positions were crumbling, not just at isolated points, but across the entire front. Divisions that had held their ground for months were falling back, sometimes in retreat, sometimes in organized withdrawal, but always moving northward, always pursued. The significance of what was happening became clear to commanders on both sides by late May. This was not merely another penetration that would be sealed by German counterattack, or another limited advance that would grind to a halt as it had so many times before. Instead, the German defensive line was breaking apart, and German forces were being forced into true retreat. Officers and soldiers alike understood that the beachhead at Anzio, that small, trapped, and seemingly useless enclave on the coast that had tied down German reserves and inflicted casualties for 4 months, was about to become exactly what it had always been intended to be. The moment was approaching when forces breaking out from Anzio would meet forces pushing up from the south, when the geographic separation that had defined the Italian campaign for months would cease to exist, when two